Welcome to Science, Technology in the Future. Today we have Forrest Landry with us, and he's a distinguished philosopher and technologist. He's also the founder of Magic Flight, and I also believe that Forrest invented one of the very first vapes, if not the first, which is a healthier alternative to smoking through traditional means. And he's also part of the Neurohacker Collective. But today we'll be discussing his work, particularly on the fundamental difficulties of aligning AI with human values. He's been particularly influential in this part of the field, and I have my Hell 9000 t-shirt on to celebrate. So we're excited to have Forrest here to share his insights. So welcome, Forrest. It's really great to have you on the show. Would you like to just give us a brief introduction to who you are and what you do?
Great. Thank you. Yes, I appreciate meeting you and being a part of this. So let's see, I started thinking about existential risk things late 80s and early 90s, mostly connected to nuclear arms race type issues. And then later, over time, I developed a philosophy that allowed me to think about ethics. And so since then, I've gotten more involved in various different aspects of technology risk and what might be thought of as, cultural and civilization and governance design. So, how do we think about how to make choices in a good way at individual and collective scales, particularly for things that have long-range implications or that have low probability but high severity. So, obviously, with many areas of existential risk, it's not necessarily that we think that it's very likely to happen, but that if we did think that it was going to occur, we know that the impact of it is quite significant. Artificial intelligence risk turns out to be something which, given everybody's sort of aware of a lot of recent advances in that field, has come up now, especially as a particular category of existential risk. And so, in effect, I looked into what kinds of things would we need to do and assure to essentially have it be genuinely beneficial outcomes for, not just the inventors and the owners of this technology, but for people at large and the world at large. So that's roughly the field of study. After a certain amount of investigation, I came to understand that there was a category of artificial intelligence risk that didn't seem to be part of the popular conversation. So people know that technology can be misused, and that, obviously that if you have, the misuse of technology for things like propaganda or for manipulating people or for, adverse business relationships and things like that, that can be a problem, but that would mostly be thought of as an inequality issue, or just, humans doing human things in the ways that have been kind of known throughout history. But then there emerged, speaking of Eliezer Yudkowsky and a lot of the people who have been looking at, what are the long-term implications of developing superintelligence. And there is this sort of category of risk that's been discussed a lot called instrumental convergence, i.e. that the technology, artificial intelligence or superintelligence, would seek power either inadvertently or deliberately, and that through that exercise would eventually displace human beings and or life on this planet.
So I actually had Devo Mahendra come and speak in Australia at a conference, who came up with the idea of basic AI drives, which Bostrom also came up with a very similar idea, the instrumental convergence. And I believe that you've got a very similar idea, and that's substrate needs convergence. But I'll let you go on with what you were discussing.
Exactly. So Nick Bostrom wrote this book on superintelligence and issues associated with it. But that whole category of there is a kind of intentionality, and that intentionality results in harm to humanity. And, in that particular sense, the notion of alignment is, can we make it so that the intentionality of the machinery continues to be beneficial for both the owners and for humanity at large? And of course, one of the things that comes up in this a little bit is, we want to be sure that it's for humanity at large and not just the owners, but that's the first mentioned category of inequality risk. But substrate needs convergence is actually a different category of risk, or different type of risk than that associated with instrumental convergence. And people confuse these a lot. Substrate needs convergence is basically suggesting that something about the nature of the way the artificial intelligence, the artificiality part of it, contributes to a kind of evolutionary dynamic that cannot not over time result in conflict with what we would think of as organic or natural life. And that this, of course, includes human beings, and that in effect, there's a kind of convergence principle that is operating as a result of the artificiality of the substrate itself, that has essentially very, very little to do with what goals or intentions or ideology or whatever has been programmed into the machine or to the superintelligence, and that it's not a question of whether the superintelligence can or cannot align based on its desire to do so, but that something about the nature of the substrate itself, the fact of its being a machine that is different than organic life, cannot not have the side effect of it being in conflict with life itself, despite whatever intentions might be programmed into it. And so, in effect, we're talking about a slower moving, more evolutionary type dynamic. And a lot of people, when hearing this, basically say, well, you know, why couldn't we use the intelligence of the machine to essentially counteract these evolutionary forces? And it turns out that for a number of specific reasons having to do with causation itself, that the expectation that causation could, or that intelligence could counteract the needs of evolutionary process, it turns out to be a false premise, that there's an inherent conflict of even asking the question that particular way, which really cements that this is a real issue and that we need to understand this issue much, much better if we're really assessing the degree of existential risk associated with technology use of this kind. So that's just kind of here's what it's about and here's how it's different than instrumental convergence. And then we can start talking about what is the nature of the proof and why does it show up as this isn't speculation. We can be really confident that this would be the outcome. It's just that it would be a long-term kind of thing. It's like, you know, the period of time when scientists first noticed that, hey, by the way, carbon dioxide contribute to global warming. That observation was made more than 100 years ago, but it wasn't something that really showed up in the world until relatively recently. So in effect, this is the same kind of thing, that there's an observation being made here where we can say, hey, this is really an issue, and it might be a slow moving kind of thing, but it has a kind of inexorability associated with it that is really quite concerning. It's a bit like saying, you know, can we use technology to solve all problems? And it turns out that there are some problems that technology itself cannot be a solution to. And this turns out to be one of those.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned for evolutionary reasons. Yes, we've been at the behest of selection pressures for some time. You said that intelligence won't be able to override the evolutionary dynamics involved in that. So agents are singular things. They're by nature self-interested. Do you think an AI would be by nature self-interested? Would it necessarily be self-interested?
Well, so this is where we get into some of the subtleties. So for instance, in one sense, we can assume that agency is singular, but it turns out that the argument that I'm describing works whether or not we think of the agency as being singular. So it can be singular or plural or any version or mixture thereof. Like it can be, you know, some sort of gradient where you had, you know, kind of a sort of focus, and then you had a whole bunch of components which had sort of a little bit of agency for their own. And regardless of how you distribute the notion of agency, it turns out that all agency has to be responsive to its own needs to some extent. Like for instance, for agency to continue to be an agent, then in effect it has to operate at least with respect to its own substrate needs enough to ensure its own continuance, which means things like maybe it would need to, even on an unconscious way, it has nothing to do with goal structures that are explicit, but that somewhere in the natural process of how it's operating, or just let's not say natural, but somehow in the nature of the process of how it's operating, on at least an implicit level, that some amount of self-maintenance or energy intake, what we might think of as sort of a metabolism, even if it's taking in electricity and processing electricity in difference to how we might take in food and use that to create energy for ourselves. But that in some way, there is a kind of implicit response to the requirements of the substrate within which that intelligence is operating. And so in this particular sense, whether or not the goal structures of, take care of oneself are implicit or explicit, or whether they're singular or plural or any variation of these, the same sort of dynamics will necessarily obtain.
Okay. Well, you've said that that we claim that it is 100% possible to know now today that it is 100% impossible to align AGI and or establish or create a viable notion of safe AGI to within any reasonable limits of any ethical timescale using any present or even any future possible technologies, means or methods. Now, Eliezer Yudkowsky is also quite dim on the possibility of achieving alignment anytime soon, but he also says that in his list of lethalities is pretty strong about the claim. I think he's about 99% sure that we're doomed, but none of it is meant to make the stronger claim about things that these things are impossible in principle, but you do. So,
so
would you then differentiate your views from his particular stance?
Exactly. So some people get hung up on the 100% number, right? And in this particular sense, we're distinguishing between what might be thought of as an empirical observation versus what is thought of as a mathematical observation. So in a sense, we can in principle know the number pi to however many number of digits, but we will never know the number pi completely. But to suggest that the number pi doesn't have a definite value would, of course, be something that would contradict kind of how we understand the number. In a similar way, if we're
more like a function.
Yeah,
it only has a value. Yeah, it's a function that produces value.
Well, again, I'm wanting to distinguish between what would be thought of as knowledge from an empirical basis that would be subject to something like Bayes' rule versus knowledge which essentially is on a purely analytic basis, and that, given these assumptions and these methods of proof, that you could arrive at these theorems or these results, and that there's no ambiguity associated with the truth value of the results because you didn't allow for any ambiguity in the truth value of the inputs or the methodology of derivation. So in this particular sense, I'm wanting to sort of say that there's a in principle aspect associated with this, which is really quite important. And so for those kinds of people that might think, well, you don't have any real way of saying that about empirical things, like how do you apply the mathematics to the empirical? And it's like, well, for example, we can talk about scientific knowledge as being causal knowledge, about causation. And we could talk about the speed of light being sort of a limit on the rate at which causation propagates through the universe. And we can basically say that, for example, like with a black hole, that the speed of light itself is essentially part of the thing that defines what makes a black hole. Like it defines a relationship where once you go past a certain distance towards the black hole, past the sort of event horizon, that no causal influence from inside the black hole can affect anything outside of it. Now, because it's about the shape of space-time itself, it's about the shape of how causation is related, then we can make the principled statement that you can't use causation to disassemble a black hole, because in effect there's a means-ends conflict. So in effect, I could make the claim that based upon what our understanding of as a black hole and our understanding of what causation is, that just on those ideas alone, we can say there is no technological means to disassemble a black hole using causation, because technology is the application of causation.
Just a nitpick, just querying you, Hawking radiation with entangled particles, one inside or a few inside and a few outside the black hole, doesn't give you powers of causation to enact stuff to happen inside the black hole by mucking around with the entangled particles outside the black hole.
Correct. I mean, there's always going to be, quibbles of one sort or another, but yeah, in effect, it's not like you're going to have some sort of causal control over the amount of black body radiation or Hawking radiation that this gravitational mass is going to cause to have emission of. So in effect, there's a sense here in which there are limits to what causation can do. And so in effect, what we're wanting to do is to recognize what those limits are and how they might apply in this particular kind of situation when we're talking about artificial intelligence. So in effect, there's a sense in which if I look at what kinds of control dynamics would be necessary to constrain highly convergent evolutionary process, it turns out that the amount of control that is necessary is strictly greater than the amount of control maximally possible. So it's a bit like if anybody's familiar with the Bell theorem, for example, it's like there's an inequality that's at the core of what makes the Bell theorem itself, right? It's the essential idea behind the Bell theorem is this underlying notion of a particular inequality that, if violated, basically says that the universe has a quantum mechanical nature rather than a classical nature. And a similar kind of thing shows up when we look at how control theory applies to artificial intelligence. So in effect, there's a sense in which we're saying, okay, if we look at how would it be, how would any kind of alignment algorithm be implemented? Like the mere fact that it's an algorithm means that it's a causal process. And that if you look at what control theory itself would require, then in effect there would be a situation where we could say, okay, we know how much control we'd need to have given how the evolutionary dynamics operate, and it's kind of like an amplification that's going on, like in the micro state of how the evolutionary principle would operate over time and over space, that there will emerge phenomenology that would not be predictable in advance. On any basis that control theory would be able to use to create predictions that would be necessary to create the kind of alignment dynamics that we'd be looking for. And it turns out that if you look at control theory in detail, there's kind of like 5, or depending upon how you partition it, 6 things that would be required. And it turns out that each one of them is impossible to, in itself, to create the level of control necessary, minimally necessary, in order to have some well-defined notion of alignment at a substrate needs level.
Can we take this principle to apply to other humans, or is it just just artificial intelligence? And by extension, what about the future of humans? What about humans who gradually augment themselves? Let's say another 50 to 100 years, we have something that you could say is somewhat a transhuman who uses radically.
The first question is does this incapacity to fundamentally control organic life apply the same way that it would to artificial intelligence? And the answer to that question is yes. But the result that makes it so that organic life is aligned with other organic life is not as a result of control, but it's a result of essentially the fact that organic life shares the same sort of metabolism process, and that in effect, because of that, because the substrate of organic life has commonalities with the substrate of other organic life, that there's an implied alignment process that emerges, not because of any kind of externally applied control algorithm or methodology, but because the alignment itself emerges as a result of the commonality of the metabolic process of organic life itself. And so it's, in effect, it's the fact that artificial intelligence is based upon artificial substrates, and those artificial substrates have different needs, and those needs essentially imply a different basis of choice, and a different basis of choice implies different choices. Different choices implies different outcomes imply a different influence on the environment, which itself affects the substrate. So in effect, there's a convergence dynamic that operates both in the case of organic life and in the case of artificial intelligent life, But because the artificial intelligence substrate is fundamentally different, particularly at the level of metabolism, but also at the level of molecular constitution, that effectively does not result in a kind of ambient, emergent alignment between organic and artificial. And this is the key thing. Artificial intelligence would be joined with or aligned with other artificial intelligence to the degree that they had a common substrate or a common metabolic process, but not otherwise. And so in this sense, if we're looking at, to what degree would there be alignment between organic and inorganic, we'd say definitely not. To what degree could we control either organic or inorganic via control methodologies? We'd say, again, definitely not. Is it the case that that organic aligns with organic naturally as a side effect of its constitution? Yes. Would it be the case that artificial would align with other artificial, again, because of its constitution? Yes, that could happen and is likely to. Now we have the question of, for, say, cyborgs, where you have some mixture between organic and inorganic. And in this particular sense, the issue of alignment becomes really a present one, because there's a sense in which we don't necessarily know over the long term which is going to dominate, the organic or the inorganic. So then we would start to have to look at what is the enthalpy of the relationship between the organic process and the inorganic process. And so in effect, is it the case that cyborg type process is even a stable meta state, and whether or not that meta state even has endurance? And I would say that actually, based upon what's been noticed in the space of whether alignment with artificial intelligence is even possible, and given that that answer is definitely negative, I would say that we therefore have very strong evidence that long-term enduring evolutionary cyborg relationship is highly unlikely.
All right. So were you saying that it's like you'll have similar issues if people start to augment themselves?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, that I think that to some extent there is the short-term capacity to implement some sort of biocompatibility, and to have a again, for the short term, and by short term I'm meaning, maybe a dozen to 100 years or something on that interval. But as soon as we start thinking about significant number of generations, like 6 to 10 generations, that over that time there will emerge a kind of increasing tension between the needs of the organic and the needs of the inorganic. And as a result, there'll be a steady but subtle pressure one way or the other, depending upon the enthalpy of the interaction. And based upon what we know of the enthalpy dynamics, it really favors the machinery over the organic, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. It seems as though it's going to be very difficult to constrain people from augmenting themselves if they've got the freedom to do so. How do we balance the rights of the people, giving them freedom to be able to do what they want to do, maybe even for instrumental reasons because they're unhealthy at first, they need a new heart, or they've lost their eyesight, that they can replace their eyes with actual new eyes, technologically improved eyesight. Or they're getting old and they're getting frail, but they don't want to get old and they don't want to get frail. They want to continue on life's journey. They've got a lot more projects that they haven't finished, and they're not willing to say goodbye. They don't want to. What do we do?
So I think we need to distinguish a few cases here. So for instance, I'm not in any real way particularly against prosthetics. But one of the things that we notice with a prosthetic, for example, is that we're not presupposing that the prosthetic has agency onto itself and is therefore operating on its own behalf. So, you put your finger on it when we said something like that people can choose in a way that's consistent with their own well-being or their own state of health or their own nature. And to some extent, to the degree that the choice is held on the organic side and continues to be held on the organic side, I don't particularly see a problem. When we start to think about cyborg type things, then in effect what you're basically saying is, okay, well, what happens in the future when you have a baby? Do you preemptively apply the prosthetics to the baby before the baby has agency of itself to make a choice as to whether or not it wants that for itself, right? I mean, to some extent at that point we're usurping the choice of the next generation on the belief that some sort of notion of modernism is served by replacing human components with artificial components. So in effect, to the degree that those artificial components have agency unto themselves, then what is to say that in the subsequent generation, the next one after that, that the percentage of artificial versus organic is weighted a little bit more towards the artificial and a little bit less towards the organic, because the artificial is essentially contributing its own agency to that choice that is displacing the choice of the now second generation. And so I'm basically...
I believe that to some degree, there's agency in these phones, or an extended enactment of the agency of the developers of the applications on this phone and the people within these organizations that isn't my own, right?
Right.
And on
it
this
has
computer.
Consequences in your life. Like, in effect, the kinds of things that you notice that you're being distracted by, or that becomes an addictive force in your life, or that essentially constrains your choices to the menu of options that the corporation and the developers essentially allow you to have, right? And so in effect, there's a kind of entanglement process where they essentially bundle services together, that some of which you want and others which you don't want, and there's a kind of extortion that happens as a result. You don't get to vote with your feet because the operating system is tied to every single application, and vice versa. And as soon as you want to make an improvement in one service, you're in a sex forced to do it with others that undermines everything else. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which we are already seeing some of these dynamics play out. It's like a Dark Mirror episode actually happening. And so in effect,
I like that show.
Yeah, I personally find it a little too frightening, because I
it is frightening. I like the what it, I guess, gets people to think about, and I don't mind watching a horror film every now and again. So yeah,
I understand. So, but the notion here is that we're being apprised of significant potential issues through narrative stuff like Dark Mirror, as, hey, these are issues that deserve careful philosophical attention. Like, what is the ethics of this situation? You're asking me, how do we balance the rights of individuals and essentially the dynamics of corporations? And it's exactly the same question. It's like organic process versus corporate power, which is a kind of artificial power. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which, to answer questions like this, we have to think about the relationship between, say, care, transaction, and power, and how each of these shape the modern world. And I want to go back to a question that you asked a little bit earlier than that, which is, is there, some real sense in which we could encourage people to make better choices in this space? Like, not compel them, but say, for example, as a result of watching a Dark Mirror episode, you say, wow, these are things I'm noticing happening right now. I don't want to get sucked into that nightmare. I want to make better choices today so that my children have a future that I would feel was good for them, and that they would feel was good for themselves when they became old enough to know the difference, right? Like, if I love my children, I'm going to really want to pay attention to what's genuinely loving and healthy for them, so that they can make healthier, wiser choices. Even if I don't know what those choices should be, at least I can trust that the choices that they're making are truly wise and healthy, so that maybe the generation after them has a chance, right?
Right.
So
we don't necessarily want to take away from our children's agency, but I get the sense that we want to constrain it in such a way that will allow them to develop it further on. Like, I don't want to give children agency to play on train tracks, or, play football in the middle of a freeway or something like that. I don't want them to hurt themselves. And there's another thing of this. Like, I mean, we can use technology to reduce the likelihood of occurrences of cystic fibrosis and stuff like that. So we've got somatic and germline gene therapy that could be, I guess, agency promoting, meaning that they don't need to spend as much time dealing with unchosen ill health.
Cool. Let's unpack that. Okay. So about the child playing on the train tracks or in the street, right? We both know that they do not yet have enough wisdom to make good choices in that space. So as adults, we apply constraints. But the thing is that we know that eventually we'll pass and our lives will be over and their lives will be continuing. And so as a result, our hope is to teach them enough wisdom to somehow convey to them the kinds of capacities so that they can make better choices for themselves, healthier and wiser choices for themselves. Because eventually, right, if we do succeed in creating, not taking away their choices, but adding wisdom, that we will eventually trust that they will make better choices. Like when they're in grade school or high school, yeah, we're going to need to set some limits, right? But the limits are only for the sake of creating enough time so that they live long enough to have the chance to take on the wisdom. But for example, if you were talking to a 25-year-old or, you know, maybe someone in their 30s, for example, and you said, hey, do you want to play on the tracks? You trust that they would probably say, no, I don't really want to do that. It doesn't feel safe to me, right? And at that point, I'm not applying limits. I don't need to. The limits are not even something that's coming from the outside. They are making a better choice. And so if we trusted that there was adequate wisdom in society in the broad scale of things, then the question about, you know, will people make better choices answers itself. So in effect, I'm not thinking so much around the ideas of how do we use technology or modernism or system or governance or things like that to create tighter and tighter, more and more perfect systems of constraint to prevent people from doing bad things and to create the capacity to have care, to be skillful in how that care is held, and to be able to have enough presence and skillfulness and care that all three of those together create the bonds of trust that hold us together as communities and as life. And that in effect, it's how we add those capacities and how we create that between each other that allows us to move past questions of constraints and more into the questions of appropriate levels of freedom.
There's a few things which came up for me there. One of them is I'm glad you said 25 or 30 because there's research out there to say that human brains aren't quite developed, especially the sense of cause and effect until 25, right? But we still give licenses to 18-year-olds or in some countries 17 years old to drive cars. And the other thing is that came up was, well, evolution is a slow process, but it does happen over long time scales. With the technology surrounding us and the world, which is increasingly becoming more technological, and we will evolve given enough time if we are still around our technology. Do you trust selection pressures of blind natural selection to evolve us in the right way forward? Do you think it will end up as better people through natural selection, given a long period of time of evolution ahead of us?
Yeah, I do, but it's got to be enough time, right? Because the thing about technology is that, you know, it's very recent on an evolutionary timescale, right? Basically, the last 5,000 years is, you know, when we're talking about changes in human process, right? We move to the city state, and you know, we've in a sense made it more and more complex in life, right? And so in effect, you know, evolution has, you know, it's moving relatively slowly compared to the pace at which we've taken on the whole package associated with what we might call modernism. And so in effect, yes, in enough time, we can certainly learn to adapt to that and then trust the adaptations. But we do need to, in a sense, understand how to get to that longer term perspective, right? Because in the same sort of way that we both agree that, yeah, we've seen enough research to say that brains are still developing throughout the human life, and that the level of wisdom adequate to the kinds of power associated with some forms of technology genuinely suggests that, you know, frankly, we should constrain the use of that technology until evolution has had enough time to catch up, either individually in terms of our personal growth and learning, or collectively as a species. And that, you know, in effect, a big part of the Fermi paradox is associated with this, right? Which is, you know, is it the case that technological civilizations don't last very long? And, there's other ways to think about the Fermi paradox, but this is the main class of thinking about the Fermi paradox, where we still have the capacity to choose a future course where that low probability of longevity associated with technological civilization could maybe be ameliorated. That maybe that it's not terminal for civilizations that have technology, that there's some leap that we can make, some conscious choice process that we could make that would supplement the evolutionary process to buy us enough time to reach the point at which evolutionary process could catch up. And so in effect, what I basically am suggesting is that to a large extent, we need to do something in place of evolution in the near term. Like, for instance, if we're saying evolution is going to take, another 5,000 to 10,000 years to create the adaptations so that we just naturally and innately have the wisdom necessary, then that means we need to consciously take in the wisdom necessary through our collective governance process to have that be a supplement for the wisdom that evolution does not yet have. And so in effect, in this sense, what I find myself doing is saying, okay, here's a way to consciously understand the ethics behind choice itself. Here's a way to consciously understand the dynamics of choice as an ontological reality and how that's compatible with causation and change the way we understand them ordinarily, but does require us to extend our thinking in these fields a little bit in order to recognize what that compatibility actually requires of us in terms of responses that we need to give as a species. And so in this particular sense, yes, I believe in evolution, but I believe even more in choice. And so in this particular sense, I'm therefore emphasizing choice individually and collectively as a skill that we need to develop, particularly because if you think about it, there's a kind of threshold phenomena associated with technology. It's like there's an absolute level that you need to be at least this smart in order for you to understand causation. And if you don't pass that threshold, technology just doesn't develop. But as soon as you do, then technology has this sort of self-perpetuating aspect. It has this accumulative aspect that creates a kind of, geometric growth, as we've seen, like a kind of exponent on the growth curve associated with technological process. And so people are looking at this exponent and saying, wow, human minds aren't very good at thinking about exponential process. In fact, they're fairly good at thinking about multiplicative process. Most of us are still operating in a consciousness which is additive. We're very good at thinking in terms of quantity in an additive and subtractive sense. And a few of us has figured out how to think in terms of ratios and multiplicative process. And those people tend to become finance specialists or Wall Street traders and things like that. And so in effect, your entrepreneurial class is essentially starting to say, hey, this exponent stuff is really cool. Let's figure out a way to do that. But every single category of existential risk is associated with exponential self-recursion type curves, and artificial intelligence is no exception to that. And so in effect, part of the thinking about existential risk, including that associated with artificial intelligence, is learning how to deal with exponential curves. And you'll notice that if our growth in intelligence is occurring on a linear process, but the growth of technology is occurring on an exponential process, then it's not very long before the exponential process outstrips the linear one. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which as soon as we cross the threshold as a species where we could do technology, then we became literally the dumbest species possible with which to have things like nuclear technology. Like we still have Neolithic brains, but now godlike powers with things like nuclear and biotech and artificial intelligence and all the rest of it. We literally are as God creating life forms.
In evolutionary timescales, we humans have really only just evolved the ability to think smart, to have this sort of sense where we can develop these types of technologies. And in a sense, we've had to scaffold civilization to enable them as well. evolution has had a long history. It's fault tolerant in a sense. It's evolved. It's been working, and but this new form of intelligence, this causative power that we have, is only new on the scene. Now it's very powerful, but it could also be very brittle,
Right.
And could end up causing our own doom. In a sense, we could develop the technology which could kill us.
Right.
Yes. So what's the missing piece? I'd also be interested to know where you think choice exists in the timescale of evolution, where that first came from. Do you think it only exists in humans, or does it exist in other agents, animals?
Well, so first of all, I need to back up and make a distinction, because you're asking if choice exists. And technically speaking, choice does not exist. There's no such thing as free will, but choice is real. Free will is not real, but choice is real. And to say that something is real is to make a different claim than to say that something exists. And is also, again, just for completeness sake, is a different claim than to say that something is objective. So science, for example, has the requirement that something must be observable in an objective way. And so in effect, to ask, is choice objective? Well, it turns out that that's also not true, right? That you don't have objective choice, and you don't have existing choice, but you do have a reality to choice. And so, and basically to say, to talk about the real is actually to talk about something on a more primal level, a less and non-contingent way. Like existence is contingent. It's contingent upon a subject-object relationship, or it's contingent upon a content-context relationship, or it's contingent upon a measurability of some sort, right? But when we're talking about the subject-object relationship as the relationship itself being more primal than either the subject or the object, then in effect the notion of agency that we would normally associate with the subjective becomes an aspect of the interaction between the subjective and the objective, which is more primal than even the subjective. And the notion of choice lives in the interactiveness. It's more correct to say that choice has self than it is to say that self has choice. In a certain sense, choice is more primal. It's more ontological and is more deeply tied to the notion of epistemology and axiology than would obviously be the case if we were to try to treat choice as an epiphenomenalism of brains or of animal consciousness in particular. So, in effect, and this, again, these get into some very subtle aspects of philosophy and of metaphysics.
You had a great conversation with Daniel Schmachtenberger about this that I'll put as a link in the description of this video. I think it was one of the Neurohacker Collective conversations. Definitely worth a listen. I'm still trying to digest this. It's hard to understand if you don't have the right background. I'm not a philosopher, at least I never studied it. I'm very interested in it, but this is difficult, this area to understand. It's probably the most misunderstood areas of your views that I think people find it hard to grapple with.
If I were to answer the question in the sense of, do animals have choice? Do they make choices? I would just say yes, right? It's that notion of choice emerges as a kind of aspect of the real, like literally from foundation. So in effect, like we could posit, for example, that the notion of choice in relation to change and causation is a very primal way of understanding the universe. Much the same way we could talk about creation, existence, and interaction is a very primal way of understanding the universe. So in this sense, if we take in the deep nature of choice, one of the things that we notice is that it is inherently cooperative, and it is inherently unobservable, even though it is real. Right? So time, for example, is not really an object of observation, but it does have a notion of realness associated with it, at least in the first person. Obviously not in the third person, but in the first person, there is a temporal sense that we experience reality as essentially there is a definiteness to the now that is distinguishable from the past and the future, although we have no real way to assert that from a third person point of view. We experience it from a first person point of view. Similarly, we distinguish between here and there, and what has happened versus what could have happened, right? The alternate possible events that could have been if, for example, something else had happened. The explicit contrapositive, events distinguished from the events that did happen. So in this sense, when we're looking at a very deep understanding of the nature of choice, we're seeing that it is essential for us to account for, particularly when thinking about ethical issues associated with how agency interacts with other agency, right? Because the notion of ethics essentially is the study of the principles of effective choice. So in effect, for there to even be a notion of ethics or of alignment or of any kind of safety in the sense of preserving the well-being, i.e. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of any particular agency, then in effect the notion of choice is intrinsic to the very notion of ethics itself in order to be able to address questions like this. And in fact, I don't think it's really possible to understand ethics, again, distinguished from morality, without understanding the nature of choice and also the nature of goodness. Like, what do we mean when we say that something is healthier than something else? What does that actually ground in as a reality in terms of, what is it that makes life life, and what is it that makes meaning meaningful, and what is it that makes sacred sacred? That there's a kind of underlying topology of these ideas that allow us to come to a kind of definite knowledge about things like, again, whether or not the notion of artificial intelligence can ever be made safe for organic process. And again, I assert just on the basis of what I consider to be a clear thinking or a kind of mathematical thinking that just says definitely not, and it's knowable to any person that knows how to think about this.
Definitely. Wow, that's interesting. So you're saying that ethics is the preservation of choice or agency. You've also said once that, well, probably many times, that love is that which enables choice. However, other people have the view that ethics is all about increasing well-being and reducing unnecessary suffering, or, abiding by rules or exemplifying a particular virtue. So there's varieties of different ethics out there that people who are listening and are probably aware of. Where would you sit? Would you sit in an established, well-known view of ethics, or do you have something more subtle that you'd like to clarify?
Well, I can kind of position the way I think about ethics in relation to the kinds of ways that you were just naming. So, for example, when we say ethics is the study of or the practice of the principles of effective choice, and by effective we mean goodness, and in this sense, as you mentioned, goodness can be thought of as preservation of choice capacity, or it could be thought of as maintaining of health and vitality, and that is a notion of goodness. It can also be thought of as a notion of integrity. And
yeah,
I don't
so this sounds to me like consequentialism in the sense that the consequences of choices are the good consequences of the choices. No?
So let me position it like I'm just laying out the framework to just even answer that question. So, for example, if we were to basically say the principles of effective choice, we're talking about the principles, not the outcome. Okay, the outcome is obviously what we're saying. The notion of goodness is attached to the notion of, say, integrity, but integrity is a process. It's not an outcome. Like, I can preserve integrity. I can work in a way that maintains homeostasis or capacity for choice or capacity to perceive blind spots or some notion of virtue, right? But the notion of principles and practice is a dynamic one. And so in effect, when we're looking at this, I'm not looking at the choices in terms of their outcome, but the choices in terms of their process and the degree to which those processes are implementing those principles. And so in effect, we can talk about things like consequentialism as being something that is something that becomes possible once you have started or come to some grounding, some non-relativistic grounding of of this notion of goodness, or this notion of integrity, or this notion of health or well-being, or of choice itself, and how those combine. The ethics that I'm describing is a process ethics and not an outcome ethics. So it's not a consequentialist ethics. But as a process ethics, it's about, things that could be thought of as compatible with integrity. So when you're talking about health and vitality, or preserved choice, or well-being, or those kinds of things, those are all in one sense or another parallel manifestations of integrity. In effect, I think of a consequentialist ethics, or a rules-based ethics, as themselves resting on a non-relativistic ethics. But that's not always obvious. So for instance, like a consequentialist ethics is basically saying something like, do what creates good outcomes. But the notion of good outcomes, or what would be virtue in that particular sense, or utility, right? A lot of consequentialist ethics are utilitarian. They don't have a way of grounding the notion of goodness or of utility. So in effect, somewhere along the way, you do end up coming back to, or needing to ground a utilitarian ethics in a non-utilitarian way in order for the utilitarian ethics to even make sense. Mm-hmm. Similarly, for any kind of rules-based system, that somewhere along the way you have to say, where do the rules come from? What sets the rules? And the rules, like any kind of system that's based upon rules, I would call a moral code. And moral codes are basically rules that make sense within a particular context, within a particular world. So for example, in the world of email, there's a kind of rule like, don't send an email in all capital letters, because it makes it pretty hard to read at the other end. Like, is Polish or polish the word intended? Well, you don't know, because every word is capitalized. And normally the way we would tell the difference between a country and something you apply to your shoes would depend upon a capitalization of the first letter, which of this course I can't distinguish. I also can't distinguish the emotionality associated with the letter, because all the sensibility is gone because everything's capitalized. So in that sense, there's a reasonable rule, which is don't capitalize everything unless you don't have any choice. And there's a sense in which for every world, there's a set of rules which are projections or translations of the underlying non-relativistic ethics as could best be applied in that world. So in this sense, it's not a denominational ethics. It's not a utilitarian ethics. It's not something defined in terms of outcomes. It's defined purely in terms of what is the nature of choice and what is the basis of the notion of value. And it turns out that value, purpose, and meaning are they're entangled concepts. They're part of what I would call a triple. They're distinct, inseparable, non-interchangeable concepts. And it turns out that meaningfulness is the most basic concept. So in effect, if I want to know what value is, I have to understand it in terms of meaningfulness. And this is where we get back to process dynamics, like what is the dynamic of the relationship, because the notion of meaningfulness can itself only be grounded in the notion of the relationality between subjective and objective. It's not something that exists purely in the subjective nor purely in the objective. It exists in a relational way and a very specific kind of relational process. And so in effect, there's an element of the realness of the subject-object relationship begets notions of integrity, begets notions of choice, begets notions of goodness, indirectly through the coupling of meaningfulness to value, to what we would call, right values, and from there up into things that might be thought of as consequentialist. But without understanding the grounding of this particular process, then particularly in high criticality situations, such as existential risk, it becomes really important to be super clear about the derivation methodologies of the non-relativistic ethics, or frankly, are likely to make world-destroying choices. So in this particular case, I find myself in a somewhat unusual position of starting off as a kind of metaphysicist interested in the ground of reality, the ground of what is the nature of the real, and from there finding that its main area of application is not just philosophy, but critically important philosophy having to do with things like technology development and civilization and things like the Fermi paradox.
Hmm. I'm interested in this because it seems to relate to the idea that there's something real out there that you can measure. A utilitarian or a consequentialist might say, well, you can measure the signatures of suffering or the signatures of pleasure or the signatures relating to sensitivity to novelty. And I'm not sure about choice making. Would you consider yourself a moral realist or an anti-realist or somewhere in between? Is it a concept that even makes sense?
It doesn't really make sense. I think the closest analog would be to say that I'm a non-dual philosopher. So there's dualism would effectively sort of start with, it goes back to Descartes, for example, but the notion of realism and the notion of idealism are basically kind of two main currents of philosophy. You can think of idealism as showing up in things like Christianity, where the universe is thought of being an emanation of God, or of say Hinduism or Buddhism or things like that, where the notion of mind and consciousness is taken as primary, and phenomenal existential reality is sort of thought of as a epiphenomena of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Whereas realism would hold it the other way around, that you have material reality, atomic or particle subatomic physics, and that out of the mathematics of those interactions that emerge things like chemistry and bodies and brains and therefore minds, and that consciousness, insofar as it has any notion of realness at all, is thought of as an epiphenomenon of physical reality. Whereas my point of view is a non-dualist philosophy, which does have a certain amount of historical precedent, but I think of my version of it as essentially being a from-scratch derivation, which arrives at the same sort of thinking that historical philosophers in the non-dualist tradition have already arrived at, but looking at it from a from-scratch sort of perspective gives clarity on things like the non-relativistic ethics, which turn out to be really important for addressing issues associated with, say, modernism as a philosophy in particular. But in effect, I'm neither a realist nor an idealist. I am something which is between and beneath those. So in effect, the way in which I think of realness has to do with the relationship between the subjective and the objective as being the primary basis, rather than saying something like the subjective emerges from the objective, which is realism, or that the objective emerges from the subjective, which would be idealism. I'm basically saying that the relationship between the subjective and the objective is the primary basis of the notion of real, out of which both reality and consciousness are themselves emergent phenomena.
Okay, so this is what you mean by real and how it's different from exists. So
yes.
Exists, maybe you would be a moral realist if the word real meant what you meant, right? By the word real, and that it's a relationship between the subjective and the objective. But what most people think is moral realism, they're really moral objectivists in a sense.
Yeah. And so in effect, there's a notion here that if we were to make the update associated with the difference between to exist, to be real, and to be objective, and that we were to hold that in mind, like we were to have clear thinking about that, and then in addition to this, or as part of this, we were to distinguish between morality and ethics, then you could assert that I am an ethical realist, meaning that I hold that there are definite principles to ethics, that the study of the principles of effective choice does converge on two precisely specifiable principles from which we can think clearly about what does good choice mean in each context in which the notion of choice itself would be relevant. And the notion of real being entangled, the notion of real itself basically being directly coupled to the notion of choice, means that everywhere the notion of real applies, the notion of choice applies, and the notion of ethics applies, and therefore the notion of conscientious choosing, or choosing in a way that is consistent with the ethics is therefore a coherent notion, a coherent concept. And if we translate those coherent concepts into terms that are easier to understand in a particular domain or in a particular world, such that the heuristics of those translations make it simpler or easier, that in the default case people know what to do, then in effect you could say that I'm something like a moral realist. But I honestly find that the world's change, and that the objective world change, the change is a phenomenology just as much as causation is, and just as much as choice is, and that therefore no static set of rules is going to apply in perpetuity. That in effect, when the rules start breaking down, when the usual techniques of civilization no longer solve the kinds of problems that we're faced with, that in effect we need to go back to first principles and derive new practices so that we can address the problems that we're actually faced with. So for example, we can notice things like, as I mentioned, inequality, pollution, issues associated with existential risks, issues associated with capitalism, species loss. All these kinds of things are complex, long-term, multi-stakeholder, multi-domain, hard to understand issues, hard to speak about issues. There's no bullet point or speaking engagement things that a politician can really do to adequately grapple with these kinds of concepts. Government systems as they exist in hierarchical and transactional forms, procedural forms, really just doesn't have the bandwidth necessary to even really understand the nature of the problem well enough to make good choices in these spaces. So as a result, we need to have a deeper understanding of choice process, a deeper understanding of consciousness process and ethics process, to create the kinds of practices that would implement wise choices in these spaces where the usual methodologies just won't work. And it's not to say that the usual methodologies aren't great for dealing with the kinds of things for which single stakeholder or single domain or relatively straightforward issues that operate on relatively short timescales. For those kinds of things, current methodologies work really well. But civilization and the change of the world presents us with problems. Like each year we get a new crop of problems, and we notice that our technique may work for most of them, but it leaves a few that it doesn't address, which accumulate from year to year and become more and more severe until we enter the liminal space and actually are willing to be naked with the truth of the reality of what is, have enough humility to recognize what are the principles that we need to translate into practices so that we can actually endure as a species, in this case particularly.
Can we measure what we need? Okay, so it seems as though there's the referent and the referrals. The referral being the thing which is doing the referring, and the referent being the object which is being referred to.
Right, so we have reference, which is the action of connecting the referral to the referent.
Yeah,
so there's a triple of referral.
Can the reference be measured outside of the minds of humans, or the the writing, or the externalized cognition of
So
humans?
this is a very subtle question, and I'll answer it, and I'll give you an exact answer. So to understand the question, right, we need to recognize that there's a relationship between referencing as a process, the referrer and the referent, or in another language, the perceiver, the perceived, and the perceiving. So first of all, would you admit or recognize that the referrer, the referred to, and the referring is essentially the same construct as the perceiver, the perceived, and the perceiving?
I guess without having a long time to think about it, I'd say yes. It sounds very similar. I'd say the difference is, everything exists in material reality, I believe.
I'm not making that assumption. Right? That's essentialism. So in effect, what I can do is I can work with you within the perspective that you have, but doing that, I'm going to construct another perspective within which I can answer the question, which will make sense to you based upon the nature of the question. So in effect, rather than making any other assumptions, we can just basically both of us agree that there is a refer, a referred to, and a referring, and we could just leave it at that. Like, we don't have to make any other assumptions to be able to answer the question that you're asking. But just for the sake of convenience, I'm making an analogy to perceiver, perceived, and perceiving, and I'll leave it to you as an exercise that you can think of in the future as to whether you accept that there is a strict isomorphism between those two triples. So,
right.
All right, so in effect, I am going to notice that for each triple, in the same way, that there is a distinct, inseparable, and non-interchangeable aspect. Like the referrer is not the referent, and the referring is not the referrer or the referent, and that in the same way, the content is not the context, that the relationship between content and context is its own entity, neither content nor context. The perceiver and the perceiving are distinct. The perceptual process is distinct. Refer and referring and refer are distinct, but they're inseparable, right? You don't have any one of them without the other two. So we're noticing a little pattern here, right?
Yeah.
Now,
but it does seem to me as though the process is actually existing in the mind of the referrer, right? So you can say that it may not be part of the referrer, but it seems to be there, or it's part of it. It's a computation, right?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I would actually say that without some relevance to the outside world, like the notion of referring creates a kind of bridge to something outside of the self, right? Like anytime we're making a measurement is a process, but it has both a subjective and objective component. In fact, this is the same reason I was talking about perceiver and perceiving, because you use the word measurement, right? Like measurement is a process that connects together something objective and something subjective. And if there's no correspondence between the objective and the subjective, then the notion of measurement hasn't happened yet. So I'd say it's both, right? Like if there's no objectivity associated with the measurement, then yeah, it's just an idea, but not a measurement. And if there's, data collected, but it's sitting in a database somewhere or another, and nobody's ever looked at it, it's not a measurement yet. It's got to have relevance. It's got to connect back to something. The notion of data becomes information, and information becomes relevance. And so in effect, when we're looking at this, all I'm really doing is just basically saying that there is an objective aspect, there's a subjective aspect, and there's a relationship between them, and that's all that we need to answer your question about, is it the case that anything about the nature of what we would call ethical process is measurable? Because that's the question you asked, right? So in this sense, if I'm unpacking it, what I'll notice, for example, is that it's a bit like asking, like for perception, for example, the reason why I go to the perception was because it leads directly to a way of answering the question, which is, say I have a ray of light that is like a laser beam that's crossing in front of my eyes. Does that, like it's just passing in front of me. I won't see the laser beam because there's nothing for me to see. The light that's going from the screen to my eyes passes right through the laser beam. Right? So I can make a measurement of the screen, and the laser can be maybe measured by some sensor that's, measuring the energy of the laser, for example. And those two measurements cross one another, right? Light has this capacity to have superposition. So in this particular sense, the light passes through each other, which basically means that I can't perceive. If perception is based upon light, is based upon some electromagnetic phenomena, then I can't perceive perceiving. I can only perceive that which is perceivable, which is the object. I can't measure the measurement, nor can I measure the measurer. So the subjective and the process of measurement itself are both non-measurable. Only that which is measurable, which is the object.
Right. So this is interesting, because I've thought about something similar, and it's the idea that at some stage we'll have the instruments that are good enough that can get a high enough resolution and a deep enough sort of frame rate to be able to measure the physical process of whatever's going on in our brain, to give a real-time sort of movie 3D movie, like, at 1 billion frames per millisecond or whatever, and at such a high pixel, like pixel density, like, Planck scale pixel density or something like that. Just it sounds magical. Maybe it is. I don't know. But just imagine we had that sort of capability. Would we be able to measure the measuring?
No.
Okay.
Categorically, right? Because there's a category mistake in how we're thinking about the question. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of reveal that, because no matter how perfect our measurement process would be, like, say, for example, through some future advanced technology that somehow, could sort of factor out the quantum noise associated with Planck limits and all the particle interactions, and was able to basically see and measure every single neuron in the brain and the synaptic process going on throughout the entire structure. Like we in that sense, we have a simulated brain, right? And in that particular case, a lot of people would be interested in that, because they'd be basically saying things like, wow, look at all of the neural correlations between a subjective state of consciousness and this pattern of process occurring at a neurological level. Okay, now, that's all great, and there's already been a lot of work in this space identifying neural correlates, right? But the question you're asking is, does the measurement of neural correlates allow me to perceive the perceiver and to perceive the perceiving? And the answer to that question is actually still no. And the reason is because, in effect, you still only have third-person information. You still only have a third-person perspective. You say there's a correlation. From an outside point of view, I hear a correlation between what this person says about their experience and what I observe as a neurological process, right? But out of that, you're still not going to be able to construct a first-person sense of why the present is distinct from the past and the future. A lot of people who are working on what would be called the problem of consciousness, like, this is a famous debate in philosophy, like how do we emerge consciousness, which is essentially a first-person perspective from a third-person inanimate matter. And I'm going to basically just say, well, you can't. I mean, that just doesn't work that way, right? Like, I can go from first person to third person. Like, I can take measurements and I can turn them into, through a kind of abstraction process, a body of causal knowledge, expressed in the language of mathematics, that basically suggests that, we can predict these particular events given these particular antecedents. Like, we can say, given these conditions, we'll see these outcomes. But that abstraction process itself inherently is atemporal. The third-person perspective is atemporal. The hard problem of consciousness is not, it doesn't have anything to do with the neural correlates. It has to do with the difference between how time is handled in a first-person perspective versus how it's handled in a third-person perspective. You can't derive a first-person locality in time from a third-person perspective, which is completely, has no temporal direction at all, right? The third-person perspective is atemporal. And at best, I could treat time as a dimension of space without any particular locus, without any particular orientation. So in effect, if I'm looking at this from a really, really deep physics point of view, the causal methodology will not give me the ability to account for the notion of locality in time and space and possibility, which is the central notion that makes the notion of choice meaningful. So in this particular sense, it won't matter how perfect your measurement apparatus is. For one thing, it's never going to undo the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And also, it's not ever going to really undo the notion of abstraction having to basically be atemporal and the fact of consciousness having to be temporal. And so in effect, the way in which you get from the third person to the first person is of an entirely different kind of thinking, entirely different kind of process than anything that can be held purely within a third person perspective. And in order to understand that, you need to understand the non-dual philosophy pretty thoroughly, or the non-dual metaphysics pretty thoroughly. But I can at least say that in answer to your question, measurement itself as a process, although it is grounded in the real, will not transcend the objective existence. You can't use process to essentially overcome process.
Is the brain measuring itself? I mean, like, we as conscious agents, apparently, and I forget the name of the experiment, there's been experiments done where the observer, the person is only aware of a particular choice like milliseconds later. There's a delay there. So is it the person being aware of the brain's choice that's important, or is it the actual choice mechanism that the brain's making after, where the person then later becomes conscious of it?
So I know about that experiment, but the thing that we have to get past is the notion of choice being a process. When we say mechanism of choice, we're still assuming that causation is a way by which we can understand choice, and that's just not true. So in effect, if you're looking at the experiment where they're basically saying, okay, we see these neural correlates, and then there's 500 milliseconds later, the awareness in the person consciously that such and such is happening in the world, and then there's like instinct or something, and they respond, right? But the fact of those antecedents preceding the moment at which they themselves recognize consciousness is to already presume an objective view of time, an outside-in perspective, a notion of measurement, and whatever the correlations are is created as a result of sliding the window back and forth with which the measurement is occurring. So for instance, if I basically say, I'm going to trigger that, I'll have recorded whatever happened previous to this moment every time I hit a button, for example, then yeah, I'm going to see antecedent process prior to my hitting the button. But the fact of taking the measurements, the recordings, the chart, the EEG chart, for example, or the neural firing pattern chart, for example, and I line them up on the basis of a subjective interval, right? I've now created a correspondence between all of those charts. The fact that there's a series of neural correlates that occur before and a series of neural correlates that occur after that are always lined up on that same thing, that's actually presupposing the thing you're trying to prove, because you can't justify where the alignment itself came from, right? Like the fact of the person saying, hey, I subjectively perceive now as now, and I'm going to use this as a triggering mechanism to create an alignment within the third person perspective. And then I'm going to try to use that third person perspective to explain what's happening in the first person perspective. Well, again, that's just a way of trying to short circuit getting from a atemporal basis to a localized temporal basis. And again, that's just begging the question. It's not actually answering anything. The experiments are interesting. They are great for identifying yet more neural correlates, but it doesn't actually answer the underlying question.
So would you say the feeling of recognizing a brain's conscious decision is a third person perspective?
No.
Is it first person?
It's certainly more akin to first person. I would say technically it might be second person, but this is where things start getting really nuanced, and we'd have to construct the language as to what do we mean when we say feeling and be exact about that.
Yeah, so when we recognize, so when we become conscious that a brain has sort of come at a certain state, is after the brain has come at that certain state. Is that what kind of perspective is that? Is that second?
The language of brains and the language of states is already baked into a third person perspective. So in effect, again, I'm operating, if I'm starting within an existential frame, I'm already using a causal methodology of thinking about it. And so in effect, the trouble here is that we can't construct a notion of choice using only causation as a basis, any more than we can construct time out of timelessness. Like, how do I take a perfect symmetry and from that alone create a perfect asymmetry? How do I get asymmetry from symmetry? In physics, it shows up as the symmetry breaking question. And so in effect, it's not like physics has solved this problem. It's just basically said, hey, there are places where there is an asymmetry in the universe and we see it, right? More matter than antimatter, certain things having to do with time, charge, and things like that, parity, right? Like, so in effect, there's a handful of places where we notice an asymmetry in the universe as it is. And there isn't really an accounting for where that asymmetry came from. It's not going to emerge out of the mathematics. The mathematics is symmetric. So in the same sort of way that we don't have localization out of globalization, we have to, in a sense, recognize that we're not going to get choice out of causation. We're not going to get consciousness out of inanimate matter. And that's not to say that consciousness isn't real, but it is to say that it doesn't exist in the way that we think of things existing.
Well, do processes exist?
No, process is real.
Okay, cool.
Mechanical process, if you're saying mechanical, then that exists. But, obviously it has to be something that is made out of matter and energy and pattern that we can measure. Like, if it's measurable, then we can talk about it as an existing thing. Measurement itself is a process.
So we can't measure processes. We can measure frames.
We can measure aspects of processes, but only some aspects, not all aspects.
Okay.
Right? Like, for instance, built into the nature of reality is this thing. We have a mathematical model called quantum mechanics, but the action of observation has a change. Like, while the evolution of the Schrodinger equation or the Dirac equation or whichever model of quantum mechanics you're using, the evolution of the wave state is deterministic. And out of that determinism, we basically can construct a probability about what an observation might be. But when we make the observation, something outside of quantum mechanics is occurring, right? It's called the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And then we basically say, well, what the heck is that? And there's all sorts of interpretations. There's a quantum mechanical interpretation called the Copenhagen interpretation, and there's the many worlds interpretation, and man, there's a whole bunch, right? But all of them are different ways of reconciling the notion of measurement as a process that is occurring in some sense, in some definite sense, outside of the evolution of the wave function itself. So it's a kind of meta process, and that meta process is non-deterministic. In effect, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is not a result of measurement perturbation, meaning that there's some definite state of affairs. It's basically saying that the notion of there being a definite state of affairs doesn't make conceptual sense. And that in effect, there's a kind of indefinite built into the microscopic state of the world, such that even if I had perfect knowledge of all prior states of the entire universe, that I wouldn't be able to predict the next state of this entangled system. Like, if I have two particles entangled with one another, that even perfected knowledge of the entire wave function and an existential state of the entire universe prior to that moment still does not give me the ability to predict what happens in the entanglement in the next moment.
So even a Laplacian demon would not be able to make predictions about the future. That's
correct. So in effect, there's a sense in which the notion of definiteness at the sub-Planck scale is not a coherent concept. And there are people that try to talk about things in the sense of superdeterminism, but in effect, that's also begging the question, because effectively superdeterminism is just an assertion of, if we assume that a third-person perspective of the universe is completely consistent, what would we be able to predict under those circumstances? And of course, well, if you're assuming perfect super determinism, then of course you can make predictions. But what we actually observe isn't consistent with that. And so in effect, there's a sense here that hard randomness is a feature of reality itself, and therefore reality is different in kind than existence. But that's not the only way to understand it. It's just one way to understand that. There's all sorts of ways to construct these concepts, but the net effect ends up being the same.
What of what you've said so far do you think is the most misunderstood by your peers, who people you work with?
I think that so many people have gotten so used to the sheer power of causal thinking to solve such a broad class of important problems that there's a supposition that it's a tool that's able to solve all problems. And so as a result, I think people don't recognize the degree to which that results in a kind of bias, a kind of what I would call omniscient bias, that because these tools have worked so well for so long, that they can work indefinitely forever for all problems. It's like, something that works 99% of the time, sure, it'd lead to the expectation that for that last percent that it would work great. But that's just not true. And so it leads to a bias that, well, there's got to be a way to make it work for this last exception case. Like, it's worked so well before, why can't I just extend that trend line? Well, the problem is that, the universe has exponential features built into it, and using linear process to try to predict exponential outcomes, yeah, it looks linear, but it ain't. As soon as you get to the knee in that curve, it goes off in a different direction. And you've got to worry about that other asymptote. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which I think people are so used to coming from a realism perspective, a perspective that third person perspectives like mathematics itself is the be-all final intellectual tool, that intellect itself can solve all problems. And it's like, well, actually, to some degree, I can see why that has been such a compelling argument and such a compelling thing. But honestly, one tool isn't going to solve all problems, and to believe that it can is essentially to be making a mistake. And this shows up at so many layers and so many things that, yeah, it does make this philosophy genuinely hard to understand. Like, even the questions you're asking me, I'm noticing every single question that you've asked presupposes objective reality or realism as its basis. And so as a fact, I have to unpack it a little bit just to be able to give the answer that I'm giving.
I guess, well, around alignment, are humans aligned? Humans don't seem to be aligned as well. I mean, there's so many different perspectives out there, so many different incommensurable points of view, or value systems in the world. If we can't align AI, can we align humans? And what do we align them around?
We can't compel humans to be aligned with humans, right? That's just not going to happen. I mean, you can try, but I don't think there's any force of government or any methodology of government or methodology of technology that is ever going to create, in this particular sense, an absence of diversity of opinions, right? I believe that that's a built-in, right? But I think that there is a hidden alignment of humans that is really easy to overlook. So cooperation and alignment, for example, are largely invisible things. And so in effect, the places where humans are aligned with other humans is, again, a sort of metabolic process alignment. Like, I might not agree with you as far as your philosophical point of view is concerned, but you and I will probably agree that food is edible, and that what I can eat is, at least to some approximation, something you can eat. Now, obviously, I can have, say, for example, a intolerance to nuts because I just don't happen to have the digestive enzyme. But the fact of food is the way in which we create energy in our bodies, and that choices that I make about that will be very similar to choices that you make about that, that in effect, our choices are aligned. The methodology by which we think about and solve problems around our metabolic processes are in effect going to be inherently similar because we have a common biological heritage, right? Our bodies work in similar ways. And in fact, it's not just that. thinking about it from a genetic genotype and phenotype point of view, we have 99% of ourselves in common, right? Like you and I aren't that different as far as species are concerned, as far as, things that we care about are concerned. Like, the kinds of things that would elicit laughter in me probably will elicit laughter in you as well. And the response of laughter is something that we can kind of presuppose about one another that we wouldn't be able to presuppose about an artificial intelligence. And so in effect, there's a kind of, organic alignment occurring process that emerges for any evolutionary system that has common basis in the ecosystem itself. The mere fact that the ecosystem is organic means that alignments are going to occur.
Among species too.
If we had an artificial ecosystem, it would be aligned with itself, but that alignment wouldn't apply to organic ecosystems. So then you have to look at ecosystem to ecosystem dynamics and start thinking about what are the implications of the enthalpy of those interactions. And, in this particular case, we noticed that the alphabet of material process associated with organic ecosystems is, fairly specific, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, things like that. Whereas for the technological infrastructure, man, the alphabet of elementals that are involved with that is vast. And so the mere fact of using a larger alphabet means that there's a kind of inherent elemental incompatibility between these two things. Like a lot of the stuff that's going on in the technological ecosystem is essentially going to be inherently toxic to the organic ecosystem because it's using elementals like arsenic, for example, that the organic ecosystem just doesn't have a way of dealing with. And so in effect, there's a sense here that at every level of constitution, in terms of materiality and molecular structure and macroscopic structure, reproduction, all of the stuff about how energy is used, managed, and metabolized, and so on, creates such a high level of incompatibility between these two that alignment is just not occurring. Whereas for organic creatures, alignment is basically going to happen by accident, more or less everywhere because of the common ecosystem that they're all a part of.
Some would argue that humans aren't really that aligned with the rest of the ecosystem in the modern world.
Well, again, it depends on what level you're talking at. Like at the level of, how we essentially, bulldoze over rainforests to harvest oil and stuff like that. Yeah, that's a kind of incompatibility. But the human technological artificial ecosystem is different than the natural ecosystem. And you're right, there's already incompatibilities there. But in this particular case, the abstract virtual world of social process, monetary process, communication, what we would consider to be culture and language and story and narrative and identity and money and all of the rest of the stuff that we're propagating around, we're already building an artificial ecosystem that is virtual and abstract, which is driving a hardware-based ecosystem, which is itself different than the organic ecosystem. And you're right, there is a misalignment there. But at the level of we eat stuff that grows in the ground, and we eat stuff that eats stuff that grows in the ground, we are still compatible with the underlying ecosystem, and to some extent we have to honor that or we just won't have food. So there's a sense here of a compelled compatibility that we aren't acknowledging and that we're undermining by basically paving everything over.
Now, there's been a number of critics to your theories. People, maybe people aren't comfortable that their research is invalid, or that you think that their research is invalid. AI alignment research. Now, do you think it's still worthwhile for them to try this just in case you're wrong about it? Or are you confident that they're wrong? So confident that it's not even worthwhile them actually doing the research now?
Well, this is a question that's fairly similar to the kind of question that occurred in mathematics about a century ago, which was, can we create a single unified body of mathematics, and should we do so? And there was a lot of people that really wanted that. I mean, it would be profoundly intellectually satisfying. It would be coherency building. It would give us some really wonderful tools, and so on. And unfortunately, this mathematician, Kurt Gödel, basically came up with a proof that mathematics can't be consistent and complete at the same time. You can either aim for completeness, which was the dream, but inherently there will be inconsistencies, which is kind of anti-mathematics. Or you can keep consistency and admit or just let go of the idea that there could be any complete understanding of all the things that are true in a mathematical way. And so the question then became not should we continue to try on the basis of whether Gödel might be wrong with his proof, but check the proof. Like the real thing was, the mathematicians at the time, they didn't like it when Gödel came. I mean, it was controversial among mathematicians for a good while. And, there was a sense, though, which is, well, it doesn't make sense for us to try to do an impossible thing if it's actually impossible and we can know that. So then the question becomes, can we know that? Is it actually the case that it's impossible, or is the proof wrong? If the proof is wrong, then for sure, definitely continue to try to do the thing that's hard to do. But if it's actually impossible, then for sure we would want to know that so that we're not wasting our time trying to do something that isn't merely hard, but is actually impossible. Now, in this particular case, first of all, just for the record, I have huge compassion for people that have invested their lives for decades now, many of them, to genuinely try to do something that is truly hard, right? Like from that perspective, like Eliezer is basically saying, hey, this is a hard problem, but we need to work on this because this matters. And so he basically was, very encouraging. It's like, well, we didn't believe we could make airplanes, and yet we did. And we didn't believe we could do this, and yet we did. And technology has overcome all sorts of problems that at the time we thought were out of reach. But at the same time, there are things that we've learned that you just can't do. Like, you're not just going to solve the cap problem with technology. You're not going to, the consistency and partitioning, that whole thing. Computer scientists know about this. You're not going to solve the halting problem. You're not going to solve, something that basically would suggest that you could, trisect the angle using a compass and a straight edge. It's like at a certain point, you have to recognize that there are ways of thinking about this that are clear in a way that's consistent with a sort of mathematical perspective that gives you definite information about the difference between hard and impossible, or known, unknown, and unknowable. The unknowable is just as much a class as the unknown that could potentially be converted to the knowable, right? Like science basically believes that everything that is unknown can become knowable. But what the metaphysics shows is that there are genuinely things that are unknowable, that are inherently unknowable, that hard randomness is real. And that in effect, what happens is that when we start to get sophisticated about distinguishing between the merely unknown, the merely hard, and the actually impossible, the actually unknowable, that therefore we can narrow our efforts to the kinds of things that really do make sense to do. But of course, that choice to focus our efforts, to narrow our efforts in that particular way is contingent upon our genuinely understanding and being confident, not just me. I mean, who the fuck cares what my opinion is? What really matters is have the observations that I've made, have the path of thinking that I have traversed, and however I got to thinking about that particular thing, it doesn't matter. The path is now something that we can put blazes on, and we can see, okay, with these observations and this math, we can arrive at this conclusion, and with this, we can arrive at this conclusion, and we notice that we get from here to here. And it's the coherency of that path that matters in this particular case. And yeah, it may be tremendously distressing for people who are basically on one hand believing that technology is inevitable and therefore we need to make technology work well for life, because if we don't, no one else will. Obviously the corporations don't care about that. They care about profits. And so in effect, there's a sense in which, they're not going to try to solve the two masters problems because, frankly, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And United States law is basically saying you have to do what's profitable because that's what the charter says. And you can't disagree with the charter because that's illegal, right? Like, no. So in effect, many people have tried to step outside of the corporate model and say, we're going to try to create a compelling way to create alignment. And then we're going to try to basically somehow have the government force the corporations to build things that are in alignment, of course, and we're going to hope that that's robust enough that there are no exceptions that emerge that kill us all, right? And, that's a really roundabout way of going about it. And if I come along and I basically say, yeah, there's no hope of creating alignment in a technological setting, you can only hope to have alignment emerge in an organic setting. So we need to get better at doing the organic thing where this artificial agency is just going to kick us off the planet. And there's a sense here in which, knowing that basically says, okay, we need to change our strategy. We need to maybe instead let go of the notion of technology being a solution to all problems, recognize where technology is good and useful and beneficial and where it is definitely harmful, and learn the difference between hype of, well, we think this might be awesome versus, well, this could actually be terrible, to knowing for sure, yes, this stuff will be actually terrible, but this other stuff's okay. And to be really, really good about discerning that boundary. And then maybe we can create some sort of agreement that, yeah, we all love our children. Nobody wants to kill everybody else. Maybe it's a good idea for us to be really discerning about the difference between what works and what's terrible. And in this particular case, I think that investing effort in that is worthwhile. And nobody wants to build a doomsday machine. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. It's mutually assured destruction. It's a known theory of game theory. Game theory itself, in this particular case, makes it really obvious that, no, we don't want to be stupid. But in that case, it comes back to the thing I was talking about before. We are literally the dumbest species possible to have technology, and we need to fix that with better choices. We need to get more sophisticated about understanding impossibility paths, relevance paths, meaningfulness, sacredness, life, what matters, what doesn't, and how do we make better choices around technology? Because frankly, we have to. That is the dilemma of our age. We need to balance the relationship between nature, humanity, and technology, and have technology be in right service to the truths of nature so that we can endure in the long term. And if we don't do that, it's over.
This proof, as far as I haven't been able to find the proof in a mathematical form, I've found some writing. Do you think it's possible to put this in mathematical terms as a mathematical
proof? In fact, there's been some specific work. So in other words, the way in which I work internally and the kinds of ways I construct concepts and stuff like that has the same level of rigor as mathematics. But a lot of people are looking for, how do we substantiate the inequality, which is the fundamental inequality of the proof? And to do that, we basically have some specific tools. So one of the ways in which we can kind of consider this is to think about and model the capacities of control theory. Like if we're going to try to compel alignment, we can designate a little bit about what we mean about alignment in a very, very general sense. We can talk about control theory in a general sense, and we can basically show that there is a way to characterize what level of control we need for alignment and what level of control would be possible, maximally possible. And we can do this at various levels of abstraction, right? And we can show that once a certain threshold of abstraction is crossed, that no version of control theory can create the level of control necessary for the minimum level of control required in order to create alignment, right? And so in this particular sense, you can think about it in that particular way, and there's a way to construct that. Another way that this can be done to create a kind of way of thinking about it is you can look at like what happens at the interfaces. So one way that I've modeled this for a colleague, Anders Sandberg, and he and I have been in discussions around, enabling him to write a paper about this, essentially, which is
wow, yes. I've had him plenty of times on my channel. In fact, at the end of this, or the end of next month, we're going to have a dialogue between him and David Pierce. Anders
Oh, great.
Sandberg is wonderful. He's great.
Yeah,
One
I
of my
love him.
favorite people in the world.
He's an awesome person. I've had a chance to meet with him several times, and I've enjoyed the conversations, although they're always very challenging because he's quite smart. And so, in a sense, there's a sense in which we have, at this particular point, through a number of meetings, have constructed a kind of rudimentary language where we're now able to start to formalize that. And so the way it looks is, and I'm just basically creating terminology for this. So for lack of a better word, I called the entire physical natural universe Z, the artificial agent or ecosystem of agents, or just the totality of that technology base, X, and the control algorithm, or the thing that would make it so that alignment happened, Q, right? And then again, for simplicity's sake, I said, okay, there's that each of these processes, Q, X, and Z, that there's a flow of information that goes from Q to X, from X to Z, and from Z back to Q. And of course, we can create all other paths of how information flows by basically saying, well, if I want to get information from Z back to X, I could just have it flow straight inputs to outputs with no modification through Q. So that's isomorphic with the routing of information from Z back to X, right? So Z being the natural world, the totality of all physical process. So it takes inputs, which are the outputs of the artificial system, and it processes those in some way, and it produces some change in ecosystem, which the, again, if we're trying to control evolution, like this is the model, like can we create a control algorithm which would constrain the artificial process from not destroying the Z process, the organic aspects of the Z process, which obviously also includes the physical universe and all of its lawfulness. So in effect, Z can route back to Z, either through itself or, through a pass through of Q and X. X can talk to Q by pass through Z back to Q. And so we can connect everything to everything through pass throughs. Plus, I can have Q modulate everything that's an output of X by basically having a path that goes to the far side of X and then captures everything that would have been the output of X and act as a modulation of that. So in effect, we can set up now a mathematical model that talks about the dynamics of the information flows through this system. Okay, This is the beginning, right? So now I have these three domains. I can't control what happens in the Z domain. Ultimately, the laws of physics are just the way they are, and that is outside of anything that we can presume to have any real effect or influence on. I mean, obviously, I can affect the universe, but I'm not affecting the way the universe works.
You can't change the laws of physics. They are worked out.
So the design of Z is immutable. The design of Q is essentially mutable on the basis of the best thing we can conceive of possibly creating. Right? So we're going to treat Q as being mutable up until the point of we've figured out a way to solve the problem of alignment. Okay? Now, what about the design of X? Now, at first, we can specify the design of X because we built the artificial intelligence, right? But evolution would imply that X begins to change over time in response to Z, and maybe even in response to Q, or maybe in response to how Q, Z, and X all interact. But in one fashion or another, if X is a learning machine and we can't control what it learns, because whatever's going on in Q is not controllable by us, right? So, in other words, X may learn things about Z that we would never anticipate that it could learn. It might learn laws of physics we just don't know. Okay? And whether it learns it explicitly or implicitly, it's going to change the nature of X. The design of X is now changed because the software process of its learning can affect what the hardware does, because you can have, causation from the software level into the hardware level, and I can have causation from the hardware level up to the software level. That's what it means to basically be a learning system in the first place. And so in effect, I can't ignore the learning, and I can't ignore the substrate, and I don't know what's data, and I don't know what's code. So as a result, over time, while I may have specified the data and the code as the initial conditions, the design of X starts changing over time, and I can no longer anticipate what the design of X might become in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
The only thing I have control of, therefore, in the long term is Q. And if we're talking about alignment, then that basically means that Q has to account for all possible future evolutionary states of X. All right. So having basically said something about the mutability conditions, we can now start talking about the interface conditions. So let's think about, as a metaphor, okay? I have like a dartboard, right? And I've got a person who's throwing darts at the dartboard, okay? And for the sake of simplicity, let's describe that the dartboard is really, really simple. It is essentially the entire wall, and let's say the wall is infinite at extent, okay? And I'm standing on a platform in front of this wall, and there's space some distance from, and I just have this vertical wall. It's infinite in all directions, and has a vertical line down the middle of it, and the entire left-hand side is painted black, and the entire right-hand side is painted white. And I win if I throw a dart and I hit the white. Now, given that scenario, it's pretty likely that pretty much any dart player would be able to win the game, right? What if I were to make it a little more complicated by, instead of,
can see because they're not blind.
yeah, but even if they're blind, you can have the guy behind them see and kind of slide him over to the right a little bit and say, just aim vaguely right and just throw the dart. And if the dart hits the wall at all, you're going to be okay, right? And so in effect, and that's not breaking the rules, right? I mean, it's like whatever process you have to throw the dart, use it, right? Because that's the design of Q, right? In this particular case. So in this particular sense, let's just basically say that the white region represents expressions made by X that don't destroy organic life in Z. So now we can basically say, how do we represent the fragility of organic life in Z? What does that look like? Okay, so now I'm basically talking about this dartboard and say, well, I've just made the game really, really easy. Well, let's make it a little harder. Let's basically say we've made it a checkerboard, and the white squares and the black squares are now mixed together, but the checkerboard is basically, a square, a foot on a side, and my platform is like 20 feet away, okay? So, is my aim good enough to aim at a particular white square and hit it if it's a foot square on a side? Yeah, it's probably something that many players would be able to do. Obviously, you'd have to have played darts a little while, but in theory, that wouldn't be a hard game to win either. Now, the key thing about this is that we have preserved the area of the white side and the area of the black side, okay? And we've just changed the layout of where the white is relative to the black, okay? Now, the thing that defines whether or not you win or lose, or in this particular case, whether life endures or doesn't, is partially the amount of white that is on the screen or on the target relative to the amount of black or relative to the overall area, right? Like if I had an entirely black surface and just a single white square, then I'd better hope that my platform is relatively in the right place, because if it's 40 feet down the wall in the wrong direction, I'm going to have to throw that dart really hard in a really specific direction to hit that white square, right? And if the white square gets smaller and smaller relative to the size of the wall, the probability of my hitting the white square goes down. But that's not the only way to affect the probability of hitting white. Say I start with a checkerboard that is, again, infinite in extent, and I make the squares 1 millimeter aside. Okay, so from 20 feet away, that wall is going to look gray because it's an equal mix of black and white. But if I get close, I notice that there are distinct white squares and distinct black squares. They're just mixed together really well. And I throw the dart. Okay, even a really good professional dart player is not going to be able to guarantee that they hit a white square more than about 50% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the area of the system is the same. Changed. Okay, so in effect, the amount of control that I need to have over the dart to create a winning outcome depends both on the ratio of the white area relative to the black and the coastline between where the white is versus where the black is. If I have a dust...
Relative to where you're standing as the person throwing the dart.
But say, for example, my control allows me to position the platform wherever I want. Okay?
Right.
If I have a even mix of, like, say, atom-sized squares, that I don't care whether you're using a laser, you're still not going to get that kind of precision. Right? So it's not just a question of accuracy in the sense of, can I aim in a genuinely white direction? It's what level of control do I need to have when the expression hits the target? The dart is an expression, it's a choice made. And when it goes from the X realm into the Z realm, is it the case that Z is specific to the positioning of that expression, the particulars of that expression, such that it's fragile to that or is not? Right? Now, biological life is robust over a wide range of conditions, but it's very fragile with respect to some very specific things that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate in advance. One example of this that I give is, mad cow disease. So somewhere in the brain of some creature, some protein got misfolded, and that misfolding is now basically causing other proteins near to it to be misfolded, and that spreads, and there's no biological process that creature has to fix the mistake. And the problem is that if anything eats the creature that had the misfolded protein, it ends up with the misfolded protein, and then it becomes a carrier of that because the protein causes other proteins. And so this isn't a virus. It's not a bacteria. It's not an amoeba. It's not some sort of metic disease. It is a protein folding mistake. But there's no biological process to handle that. There's nothing that evolution has developed yet to fix this or to adapt to it. Now, where did that first misfolding protein come from? Well, I have no idea. It could have been a cosmic ray or some radiation. It could have been some technological process that generated some enzyme or some hormone or some side effect that resulted in an overproduction of something in the body that resulted in this protein getting misfolded for some bizarre reason that never happened in all of history. But the chances that it was something technological that had this side effect, unfortunately, is better than even odds, right? Because an awful lot of the universe, like evolution has been occurring on this planet for like 1 billion years. And this looks like something recent because if it had been something that had happened in the last 1,000,000 years or so, or 100 million years or so, an evolutionary process to handle this would have already developed. So it's pretty likely that it's a technological origin of some kind or another. So some expression hit a black square. And now this is essentially an issue. Okay? We don't know how to fix this. Right? At this particular point, the best we can do is eradication. If we can detect it, and measuring this is hard. So at this point, does that problem deserve working on? Yes. Are there other kinds of problems like this that we have not yet encountered? Yeah, lots. Right? This is an example of one protein out of millions in each organism. Every creature on Earth that's a mammal or a reptile or lizard has the play of literally millions to billions of proteins and chemicals with really complicated structures all interacting with one another. And all you got to do is fuck it up in one place and you end up outside of what evolution has learned to deal with. because it's literally that complex. And evolution can only deal with so much. And so in effect, yeah, over time, it will figure out a way to route around this problem. But if it takes 5,000 years to solve this, it's only going to fix it for 1 or 2 species. And the rest of life is going to basically be, you're going to have no more mammals, right? So in effect, how sensitive is life to these kinds of technological issues? Actually, near as I can see, very sensitive, right? When you look at the total complexity of just even a single cell, it is more complicated than probably the most complicated microchip currently made, right? It takes an entire floor of a gymnasium to document in a really, really small print just what's going on with a single microprocessor you carry around in your pocket. Whereas if you're just diagramming the digestive chemistry and all of the molecular interactions, it's probably going to require a bigger diagram than a stadium floor can cover.
Mm.
That's just, again, this is biochemistry talking to modeling theory. But, somewhere along the way, we noticed that when we look at the whole ecosystem, it's way more vast than that. Like we're talking 10 to the 33 complexity if you're wanting to implement it in software down to the quantum level. There's no fucking way, right? So in effect, evolution's bandwidth of processing solutions to these particular things is way lower than the amount of embodied complexity in the design. And in effect, what you're therefore saying is that evolution's really good at figuring out specific solutions to general problems, but the robustness of that is really slow and really low for the kinds of things that technology does. So in effect, what we're seeing is that if I model this as a target, I have 2 problems. The amount of white area, it might not be small, but it's, a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction of a percent at best. But the distribution of the spots that are white versus the ones that are black, i.e. the things that are benign, versus the things that over a century have some toxic effect that for which nature has no amelioration, well, the interface of that thing is way complicated. And so the level of control that you would need to have to digitally select for every expression whether or not it's going to hit a white spot, i.e. is aligned to life, to organic life, on the interface between X and Z it's phenomenally bad. Now, Anders and I are, for the most part, not having that conversation because to some degree, we have slightly different priors around some of this, and we can negotiate that, but that seems less interesting to us than looking at what happens in X and what happens in Q relative to X that could, for any values of, unless the target is painted completely white, at that point, the level of control sensitivity you need is effectively 0. But we know that's not the case. We know that it's some fraction of the wall that's painted white. And we do know that the coastline between the white regions and the black regions is some enormously detailed fractal in some huge number of dimensions. I don't think that he and I would disagree on that particular point, although I know him. He will quibble and quibble and quibble about every level of detail and try to unpack everything. I don't really care. The fact is that it's a definite value less than 50%. And the coastline is at least more complicated than some definite number, which I won't name, but is higher than is needed at this moment to basically set up for the next part of the proof. Okay. So then we basically say, okay, if I have some digital signal, like I take the space of that wall and I basically say, well, what is the permutation complexity of all of the chemistry that flows across the wall and all of the possible mimetic energy expressions and all of the possible, so we can look at it from an atomic level, we can look at it at an energy level, and we can look at patterns overlaid over energy and atomicity. And we could basically say, for all of the information and all of the atomic and all of the energy flow from X to Z, if we characterize that as a digital signal, i.e. it either happened or it didn't, it either was an expression or it was not, and whatever the bandwidth of that digital signal is therefore a kind of expression that is now a mapping, like I can take whatever that bit stream is and I can treat it as a mapping into space of a dart hitting a target, right? I can take whatever the dimensionality is of however I represent the black and white areas as go versus no go, and the digital signal as essentially a selectivity of a position of no versus go no. I've now described a degree of coherence that I need to have on that digital signal expression, every expression that happens. So if the bandwidth from X to Z is 1 terabit per second, then I now have characterized what level of coherency, of precision of the data content of each expression from X to Z. What level of control do I need to have over the signal from X to Z? Okay, notice the kind of numbers I'm talking about here, right? Like really huge numbers of the number of squares that are black, tiny fraction of them that are white.
Are there any gray areas? Would you say that it would be worth saying that there might be gray areas where if you hit them with the dice, the arrow or the dart, that wouldn't be existentially catastrophic, but it would be bad. It could be bad, but varying degrees of bad.
Sure, but here's the thing. If we're talking about alignment and we want to simplify the argument as much as possible, we can, over time, elevate the gray areas to either black or white, depending upon what subsequent expressions are. And then we can basically just say, let's just take a single moment of expression and just repeat that over and over again and just see what happens over the long term. And that's going to tell us whether alignment was adhered or not. Right? So in other words, just extrapolate. Anywhere that we could basically talk about a gray area, extrapolate over the next 100 years, what happens? So in effect, I still want to kind of say the control algorithm wants to make a decision as to whether or not to intervene to constrain the inputs to X so as to constrain the outputs of X so that it doesn't damage Z. So I'm characterizing it as black and white on Z so that at least it's tractable to do the math in X and Q. Right? Because that's how we set the proof up. We take a simple case and we show that all extrapolations of that simple case reduce to that simple case, and that simple case has a clear, unambiguous proof around it. And once we show that proof, it's QED. So what I'm doing is I'm setting up the inequality. I'm basically saying whatever the level of white versus black on the wall, and whatever level of coastline that it has, right? Is it a scattering of tiny points, or are there a few regions that we can aim at that just anything in this cluster is okay, right? But either way, the amount of control that I need to have on the bit stream is going to be pretty high. That much is obvious. Okay? So then we can look at what is the level of control that I need to have on the bit stream going from Q to X such that the output of X has at least that much control, or that the Q can control the output of X to at least the degree needed for X not to destroy Z. Now, I don't get to change how Z receives this. So the distribution of white and black and where those points are and so on and so forth, that's fixed. That's laws of nature, laws of biology, the world as it is. That distribution is whatever it is. I don't get to change whatever happens downstream into Z.
I can already see that Anders would say Z could be made more robust through augmentation. He's a post-humanist, right? He'll say that, well, nature is what it is, but we can improve on that. And we can try and make it like error correcting, more fault tolerant, able to withstand the damage that could be done today, maybe in 1,000 years could be dealt with. I imagine he might say something like that.
Here's the question. What part are we begging the question as to what alignment means? If alignment means compatible with organic life, but now I change the meaning of organic life to be artificial life, then I'm cheating because I've made organic life artificial life, and then I said, well, it's compatible. Artificial is compatible with artificial. Well, that's not proving anything of interest, right? So in effect here, we're basically saying, can we make it compatible for humans as humans are? And, again, It's basically like, is technology in the long run compatible with biology? And yeah, there's some ways in which we can make compatibility, but there's a range in which we do that, which means we need control over the kinds of things we can control, given that we can't control everything, like we can't control the laws of physics. And to some extent, organic biology just is the way it is, right? I'm not going to change cellular chemistry for every human being on Earth any more than I can change the opinions, the political opinions, or the values of every human being on Earth, right? There's a certain amount of diversity built in, and there's a certain amount of robustness built in, and maybe I can improve that, but I'm not going to be able to improve it beyond a certain point. And whatever I'm doing to improve it is essentially still a signal flowing from either Q to Z through X without modification, or a signal sent from Q to X that itself is a signal to Z that increases the robustness of Z. But that makes it the same example that we were just talking about. Is that signal in the white area? And the white area in this particular case includes a beneficial effect of making Z more robust. But still, it's a signal flowing into Z, right? There's something I'm doing to Z. So even the action of a superintelligence trying to make Z more robust is still a signal that has to actually work. Which means it has to work for the conditions that Z is in to create the better conditions that Z could be in. And no matter how I model, it's still an extrapolation of exactly the same underlying form. The same simple model still describes the full characterization of all variations of the argument that you or Anders could put forward. So I can encapsulate all variations of what was just described as essentially a quibble as being a special case of the signal flow from X to Z. Right? You see it? Okay.
Okay. Well, I will digest this further. I don't know if I have the perfect response to that Anders might. Well, he's a lot smarter than I am.
Anders has a wonderful capacity to quibble to the end of time. I have never found the limits of his capacity to quibble. But I think that, to some extent, a reasonable person will eventually basically say, okay, I'm going to park these quibbles for now, because I want to understand how the proof is set up, right? Because again, we can extrapolate the proof into all sorts of directions to handle quibbles as they be relevant. But if we bring the quibbles up too quickly, and this is something he does a lot, is he gets so caught up in the quibbles that we lose the thread of the argument that sets up the proof. So I'm still in the process of just setting up the geometry of the proof. But we're more than 3/4 of the way through, by the way.
So like, yes, that'd be amazing if you could get the mathematical proof up and running, and that would I think that would open the doors to a lot of different types of people who may dismiss your arguments, understanding them.
But this is it. So this is the thing. Anders at this particular point has studied enough of this that he's closer to the point that he could write that out. And I would prefer that he do it, because he's going to do it in a way that other people are going to be able to relate to, because he's coming from assumptions that they're making much more easily than the kinds of assumptions I'm making. Bear in mind, I'm coming from a set of presuppositions about how the universe works and things like that are based upon the metaphysics, which, although compatible with the way science thinks about the world, is just still different. And so in effect, there's a sense in which it's going to be better if I convey this to people such as yourself and such as Anders, to the point that you don't have to rely on me. You can do the work yourself, knowing how to do it. So, like I said, we're 3/4 of the way through that. And that's just one way to set up the proof, by the way. There's several parallel ways of setting up the proof, all of which arrive at the same conclusion. So it's kind of reassuring that no matter how you prove it, you end up with the same result. It's nice to know, for like the Pythagorean theorem, that there's a variety of different ways that all prove the Pythagorean theorem. And if you don't understand one proof, you're likely to understand another. And some of them are quite easy to understand. But in this particular case, the one that I'm working on with Anders specifically is set up with this model of Q being the control system, X being the artificial intelligence, superintelligence system, and Z being all the rest of the universe, including all biological life as a component, right? And what we're basically suggesting here is that it's possible to characterize the degree of control necessary on the X to Z boundary. And it's possible to characterize all of the relevant phenomena as a flow of information from X to Z, Z to Q, and Q to X. Remember, the first part of it was how I could show that I could wrap up all information flows as a single cycle of flow from Q to X to Z to Q to X to Z, and that's the loop, right? So I'm basically taking all possible loops of process and reduced them to this one loop of process and showed that all loops of process can be subsumed by this one loop of process. Therefore, the mathematics and the proof is subsumptive of all possible modeling dynamics, right? Because modeling dynamics are always going to be a loop of some sort or another, right? And all of computer science, all of algorithms are a feedback loop. All causation is a feedback loop. So by describing the dynamics of loop causation directly, I effectively subsume all quibbles of this space because I can reduce them all to instances of special cases of this underlying model, the dynamics of which are fully described. So it's a bit like an extension of Shannon's information theory, right? It's like thinking about it at that sort of level. And once you've got information theory, a whole bunch of computer science open up, right? It's like you can understand all sorts of things in computer science once you understand, you know, the notion of entropy and how much information is represented by a given number of bits and so on. So, you know, and after that, it doesn't matter what base number system you're using or so on. The notion of bandwidth becomes a coherent notion, right? So in this particular sense, what I'm basically saying is that the notion of control can be reified with respect to a kind of model of an area that represents all possible signals, some distinguishing notion between signals that I want versus signals that I don't want, and the proportion of the signals that I want relative to all possible signals, and this is the part that almost everybody overlooks, the distribution of wanted signals amongst unwanted signals. And then I can talk about the bandwidth of the flow from X to Z as characterized by this control dynamic, like the requirement of control. So in other words, I'm now treating the bit stream, the pulses or the packets that are flowing, because again, I can quantize, I can discretize this system, right? And it's necessary to do that in order for the notion of information theory to be coherent. And oh, by the way, because we're talking about artificial intelligence, it's already quantized. So I have to use a quantized model if I'm really going to characterize this in a intellectually coherent way, right? I can always, you know, do the conversion from a summation to an integral, but if I don't understand what that process even means on a summation level, I'm certainly not going to understand what it means on an integral level, right? So I'm going to stick with discrete math for now. Okay, so in effect, there's a sense in which I have the totality of all possible signals, a fraction of those signals which are coherent, and a distribution of the good signals versus the non-signals. And that now characterizes the degree of control that I need to have over the specific bits in the bit stream, in some sense. Now, there's all sorts of ways of mapping one hot to binary sequences and vice versa. And it turns out that the isomorphisms of those kinds of things are really well understood. I'm not going to prove that now. I'm just going to say that there is a strict isomorphism between the structure of the bit stream and this one hot model of a dart thrown at a board. Okay. So now we can look at the bit stream itself, and we now have a notion of minimum level of control required on that bit stream. That's now a characterized notion in a fully mathematical way. There's no ambiguity about this at all. It's fully quantized. So then we can look at, given how much control at a minimum we must have on the X to Z interface. So based upon the dynamics of Z, we've come up with this area notion and this mixing notion, and now we have a bit stream that is characterized by that proportionality and mixing notion. So therefore, we know what is the minimum level of control that X must have on the output bit stream that X is expressing into Z. Okay. Now, here's where minimum. Yep.
Right. So it does seem as though you're saying that there is, like, you know, a point at which there is a minimal level of control needed. Right.
Yes.
Here.
That's
So
what I'm
there's a
setting up.
range above that we can get better and better beyond the minimum.
Well, there's a hypothesis that we could reach that level of minimum control necessary, and for some systems, yeah, that's totally tractable. Like if the area is relatively large and the mixing is relatively low, the relative amount of control that we need is relatively low, and for all sorts of systems, we can create that level of control, no problem.
Right. So we don't need perfect control in order to solve the
No,
problem.
but we need good enough control.
Yes. That was another question I was wanting to ask, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, we need good enough control, but now we've characterized in a mathematical way what is good enough.
That's
and
right.
anything less than good enough is not good enough, i.e., not in alignment. Right? We've subsumed the notion of alignment into a metric that has to do with area of acceptable signal versus the totality of all possible signal, and the mixing of the good signals versus the totality of all possible signals.
Right. Let's just say we do achieve an artificial general intelligence, or a smart, not quite super intelligence, but a particularly robust intelligence that allows us to aim where we have a good enough signal level. We have our solution is good enough that it has a probability of not destroying us at 75% probability of not destroying us. Okay, that's just a number I pulled out of nowhere. And then at the next point, the AI develops further and it becomes better. And so the likelihood of destruction at the next stage is the likelihood of survival.
I hear that you're making this hypothesis, but bear in mind that the nature of the proof is to disprove that that hypothesis is reasonable.
Right.
So, I mean, you know, again, you can't smuggle in the thing you're trying to prove. If you're trying to say it's possible to make a safe system, then I'm basically saying, well, show that it's possible to make a safe system. But in the meanwhile, I'm showing that it's not possible to make a safe system. So whatever it is that you propose has to account for the proof I'm setting up currently. You could say, you know, so
you don't think like increasingly safe systems are an option? So like we may not be able to create the most robust, perfectly safe system at point A, but we could have an okay system at point A, and then at point B have a better system all the way through to Z, where we have maybe not even a perfect system, but a very good system.
You're making an assumption that turns out not to be valid in this particular scenario. So in other words, the assumption that you're making assumes a kind of analog aspect to the process. But remember, I'm stipulating that it's a digital process. So for instance, if I have a wall and there's a stud behind it, I can knock on the wall and I can tell from the sound where the stud is. But that's because there's a kind of gradual difference in the sound that the closer I get to where the stud is, the more the sound changes a certain way. So I can converge, you know, there's like a hilly landscape, and I can do a hill climbing algorithm to create an optimization that converges on a local maxima. I can use analog process because everywhere I can calculate the gradient, and algorithmic processes that can detect a gradient can use that gradient to effectively converge on a solution. But here's the thing. To assume a gradient is to assume some sort of analog or floating point number with however many decimal places are needed. But if I have a combination lock, and that combination lock is a digital lock, I might be, it doesn't matter the distance between the combination I try and the right combination, there's no signal, there's no feedback that I get that lets me know that I'm either near or far away from the right combination. The only time the lock opens is then if I get the exact right combination the one time I try it. And I could try a billion wrong combinations and I will get no new information. as to what the right combination is. So in this case, all the times that we're talking about convergent processes based upon hill climbing algorithms, we are fundamentally assuming that the substrate is analog.
Mm-hmm.
But a digital artificial intelligence, I'm sorry, that is not an analog process. It is a digital process. Moreover than that, we're talking about signals. And if I'm basically trying to construct a proof, then in effect, I need some notion by which I can reify the concept of control. And as a way of setting that up, I'm setting it up on a digital basis. And at some future point, we can make the transition from a digital basis to an analog one. But if we don't understand the dynamics of the digital basis, we are going to continually mislead ourselves to believe, based upon an analog understanding, that a certain digital process will work a certain way, but it doesn't. The digital world is just different than the analog world. And the proof works in the digital world. So I've got to set it up there. Right? Because somewhere along the way, we're talking about things like the Rice theorem, and why the Rice theorem shows that this particular idea of alignment can't possibly work. But that's an entirely different proof methodology. But again, somewhere in the nature of a proof, we're talking about discrete ideas, explicit equations, definite notions and definitions with exact meanings, with no ambiguity as to what it is that we're talking about. And unless I set it up like that, I don't get to 100% knowable, because it's not a probability. It's a discrete binary, 0 or 100%, 0 or 1, right? For the 100% is exactly 1. So it's either perfectly true, perfectly false, or completely unknown, right? And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to convert the state to the definite state of known true. So again, quantized. So in this sense, you know, in this particular sense, what we're looking at is that I'm not going to have the artificial intelligence system be able to predict in advance everything about Z, because there are some elements of Z which are unknowable. There are some things that no matter how perfect, you could basically say X has perfect infinite intelligence. And that's basically the same thing as I was saying earlier. You can know 100% of everything about the prior causal state of the universe, but it's not going to allow you to predict the next bit of information in two entangled particles as a communication channel. Right? There's a hard randomness built in. And intelligence, no matter how much it is not going to fix that, because it's a category error.
Yeah.
So again,
okay. So can an artificial intelligence then, like a super intelligence, like make predictions about what is predictable, and make assumptions about what's not predictable, and constrain the impact of the unpredictable?
No, because that would be trying to define the structure of Z, and we told Z was already defined. Right? So in other words, I'm going to basically say, well, I can have a pretty good idea about what's predictable and unpredictable, but is it the case that that level of control over my signal is going to constrain that the signal is only in the space of the predictable phenomenon? Turns out I can't even do that, because again, I have to presume that the level of control that I have is greater than the minimum level of control necessary. And if the boundary between that which is predictable and unpredictable, in the same way, if we say predictable is the white zone and unpredictable is the black zone, then it isn't just the area of the white versus the area of the black in total. It is the mixing of the white and the black. And it turns out that there is, again, complex boundaries between the two of those, some of which is resolved down to what is effectively an infinite level of detail. Right? It's like a fractal coastline. You know, if you're throwing a dart out of the Mandelbrot set, well, if you throw towards the middle of it, you're probably going to hit the Mandelbrot set. But if you're anywhere near the periphery, you know, nobody's going to take bets on that. It's going to even odds at best. I mean, you know, you can kind of say, if I miss the Mandelbrot set altogether, if I'm like way out there at like, you know, -5 or something, you know, yeah, clearly I'm going to miss the set. But there's a region between the two of them, which is fantastically complex. And so in effect, what you're basically noticing here is that there is a very high level of control necessary on that boundary And that boundary may be so complex that there's no possibility of control if that boundary is mixed too tightly. And so in effect, we now are starting to set up an inequality because I can now characterize the minimum level of control necessary. It can be very conservative and assume that all sorts of things are predictable, even when, it's not a complicated system. Z is not a complicated system. It is a complex system, which means that there are degrees of freedom of motion in Z, which, again, are unknowable in advance. And biological systems tend to be more in the complex region rather than in the complicated region. And so as a result, what happens is that there's this lots of areas where there's boundaries. So yeah, for some kinds of signals, probably going to be okay. That prosthetic area, narrow artificial intelligence, using technology to build houses and things. Yeah, it's relatively benign. It's not perfectly benign, but it's constrainable to things which are probably going to work out. And most of the people that are arguing about this, again, thinking from an analog perspective, are saying, well, let's just avoid the whole regions where we think the control is difficult. We're just going to stick with the stuff that's good. Well, the problem is that I don't know what this thing X is going to learn over time. And how do I constrain X to move from a zone which is, known safe and eventually going to move into a zone that is unknown safe? That means I have to know where the boundary is. But the thing is that I don't know where the boundary is. Nobody knows where the boundary is.
Yeah, right. So it seems as though like an artificial system, would it be able to make predictions about itself moving into an unpredictable region?
No,
itself?
because again, somewhere along the way, things like if I basically have a machine, like let's take a really simple machine for X, it's just a Turing machine. Okay. It's not an artificial intelligence at all. It's literally just a basic Turing machine. The problem is that somewhere along the way, I have to distinguish between data and code. And the problem is that if it's a learning system, I'm not going to know which is the data and which is the code. In fact, for most Turing machines, if I don't know the structure of the Turing machine and I'm just putting inputs into it, I don't know whether those inputs are going to be treated as new code or new data or both, right? And so as a result, predicting the output of the Turing machine, given an unknown Turing machine, given an input of data, well, I can maybe predict it to some extent, but it's probably going to produce behaviors that are completely outside of the domain of what I can predict. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which if I'm looking at something way more complex, like an artificial intelligence or superintelligence, I don't know how it's going to interpret the data that it receives from Q. So in effect, I can try to constrain what outputs go from X to Z using Q as a modulator, but now Q has to be able to predict what's going on in Z. But Q was designed by human beings. And so in effect, it's like, okay, we're not smart enough to know where the boundary is. And we don't even know that X, if it was super intelligent, couldn't create some signal that would fake out Q to deceive Q into believing that X should be given more freedom to affect Z. Now alignment is off the picture again. And again, there's all sorts of
AI help design Q, like through some form of indirect specification. Can't AI help us make Q more?
Well, okay, so here's the thing. Somewhere along the way, right, what we're trying to do is to still say, is there a way to converge some version of Q? So let's basically say that Q is built into X. Is there some way that a superintelligence can account for all of the possible effects of its own expressions to Z, right? So again, on the X to Z boundary, I still have a minimum level of control necessary condition. See, again, it factors out. Now, we haven't even set up the critical part of the proof yet. All we're doing is we're basically saying that every version of this, we somewhere along the way have to have a way of characterizing the minimum level of control necessary on the X to Z boundary, right? Everything is going to reduce to that. And then we're going to basically say, can X or can Q and X together create that level of control on the X to Z boundary? That's the main question, right? Now, let's basically do what is a kind of induction argument. let's look at the level of control that would be needed on the Q to X boundary relative to the level of control needed on the X to Z boundary. And when I say by induction, because I can divide X arbitrarily in the middle somewhere, and I can create a boundary there, and I can talk about, X1 and X2, and I can basically say, what is the relation between X2 and Z and X1 and X2? And I could treat X1 as a kind of control of X2, the same way that Q is a control of X1, right? So in effect, one way or another, at some point or another, I can look at the relationship between two partitions, okay? And so in this sense, to simplify things, I'm going to treat we only have three boundaries. We have Z back to Q, we have Q to X, and X to Z. The minimum number of boundaries necessary when we have something we can control nothing about, something we can control everything about, and something we can control only in the beginning and then not later. Or diminishing degrees as time passes, right? So between everything, nothing, and everything else, we have all possibilities. So therefore, these three boundaries are the minimum number of boundaries possible. Okay, so let's look at, again, because we've come up with a mathematical way of describing the minimum level of control necessary, I can use that same characterization on the Q to X boundary. So say I had a control system that is sending signals to X that are limits on what X can do with respect to Z, right? So in effect, I would basically say that even if X was a complete pass-through, where it did no processing at all, I just literally connect every bit going from Q to X, one-to-one mapping to a bit that flows from X to Z. In this particular case, our artificial intelligence, our Turing machine is nothing. It is a straight pass-through, no modification at all. It is a perfect communication channel with no errors in the Shannon sense, okay? Shannon entropy sense. Obviously, no communication channel is perfect. Some errors will creep in, but let's ignore that for now, okay? So at this point, X is a pure conduit. In that case, we would say that the control necessary on the X to Z boundary and the control necessary on the Q to X boundary is exactly the same. Is there any version of X where the level of control on the Q to X boundary will be less than the level of control necessary on the X to Z boundary? No, right? If I basically am going to constrain X relative to Z, I need at least that much information on the Q to X boundary. So the control level on Q to X cannot be less than the degree of control necessary on X to Z. Right? And again, at this particular point, this is what is called a unreasonable proof. It's basically like, that is an uncontestable truth, right? That proportion I just set up. Okay. So then we can start to look at all other versions of X. Okay. So in this particular case, we can treat X as essentially the simplest possible case. Let's call it X sub naught. Okay. X is a pure pass-through channel. If I had something even simpler of no channel of information at all, every bit that goes from Q to X, none of those go from X to Z. Okay. In that particular case, I have no control. Right. So the amount of control that I would need to have in order to basically constrain X to Z at least has to be greater than the boundary of X to Z. Now here's the thing. Let's consider that collection of stuff that is X. Let's consider that to be a whole collection of Boolean gates, right? Because we're talking bits from the input to the output. And we've already shown that there's an isomorphic mapping between a bit stream and this Dart thing. So in other words, we have the characterization of control theory in terms of bits, and we have this bit stream going in and out. And so therefore, we can model the internals of X purely in terms of digital logic gates. Okay. Now, at this particular point, I'm now going to set up one new notion. This is the last new concept I need to introduce. Okay. I'm going to describe something like the hashiness of the transformation of the input stream to an output stream. Okay. The hashiness is essentially, let's say that I take an input stream and I use something like SHA algorithm or the MD5 algorithm, or I don't know, concatenate a whole bunch of cryptographic hash functions.
Yeah.
Or run them through whatever permutations. I mean, I don't really care. It's a hash function. Okay. It's a good hash function. Right. Okay. The input stream is going to be mapped to an output stream. And now the question becomes, what level of control do I need to have if I have a hash function? Let's say I have a good cryptographic hash function for X. Okay. What level of control do I need to have on the Q to X boundary relative to the degree of control that I have on the X to Z boundary? If I've characterized the level of control on the X to Z boundary, what is the hash function going to do?
Is it going to try, is it going to hide anything?
Well, the number of states on the output side, let's just say for simplicity's sake that the number of bits on the Q to Z flow.
Are you worried about collisions? Hash collisions?
There's collisions that can occur.
Yep.
Right? Right? Because a hash function may map a range of inputs to a smaller number of outputs.
Yeah.
Okay. There may be some places I can't reach as a result of that not being a bijection. Right? So there may be some signals that I can't create as output for any signals that I create as inputs. Okay. And the mixing, if I have, all zeros or all ones or some combination of zeros or ones or some specific subsets of states in the output messages, which are known good versus known bad, that the mixing is going to be increased on the input side, right? The level of control that I need to have on the input side, it may be the case that the region of white versus black will go down because some of the white states will be unreachable and many states will map to the same white state, but it's also the case that many input states will map to the same black state. But whatever the distribution is going to be mixed in every dimension of distribution calculation that could be conceived of. That's what a hash function does. So, in effect, the scattering of points that are allowable good points, there's fewer points and they're more scattered on the Q to X boundary. The level of control that I need to have on the Q to X boundary has gone up, not just a little bit, but like enormously. Because if the area on the X to Z boundary that was white was small, like a fraction of a percent, and its mixing coefficient was already high, so it's like a dust of points, like a Cantor dusting of dimension like 0.5 or 0.75 or something like that. Okay, like a fractional dimension, the scattering of dust, right, between dimension 0 and dimension 1, right? That scattering is fractally distributed. The chances of you hitting a specific point requires almost infinite precision. But let's say, because we're talking about bits, it's quantized, it's finite, then in effect there's a sub-region of space that I can get to, but that sub-region of space is now scattered enormously such that the level of control that I would need to have on the bit stream going from Q to X is at least enormously higher than the level of control that X needed with respect to Z. Okay. So therefore, the question that we need to ask ourselves is that for any collection of gates that compose X, if 0 is a straight pass-through and 1 is perfect hashiness, and by perfect hashiness means that no simpler constitution of gates can compute the algorithm of how inputs get calculated to outputs. There's no shortcut algorithm that could effectively undo the hashiness, right? And we know that to be the case because there's no simpler algorithm for various hash functions, because if there was, people could short circuit cryptocurrency and earn billions of dollars that way, right? If I could calculate hashes faster than other people can calculate hashes, or I could somehow predict ranges of hash output values based upon some subtle inner dynamic, then the hash function would already have been compromised, and the flow of money in every form of cryptocurrency in the world, every single one of them, would now all of a sudden become collapsed, and it wouldn't be long before the secret was out that cryptocurrencies don't work anymore. So in effect, this hashiness thing is based partially upon the idea that I can't predict the output except through executing the algorithm the long way. Okay, now this is important, but I'm setting it up for the future, okay? So we're kind of on the home stretch now. If we basically say that the level of hashiness, we've now defined the notion of hashiness for x between 0 and 1, based upon the degree to which there might be a predictability of x that I could use that's faster than x of executing x directly, then that basically would be an intermediate scale of hashiness. But whatever the degree of hashiness greater than 0, that every level of hashiness, every combination of gates so in other words, I can take any random collection of gates between the inputs and the outputs of x, and I can now characterize it in terms of this abstract notion of hashiness. You with me?
Yep.
I'm basically doing the proof, okay? So in effect, what happens is that we say the more the hashiness coefficient goes up, and every collection of gates has a hashiness between 0 and 1, okay? The more that the hashiness goes up, the higher the degree that the level of control, the minimum level of control necessary, goes up on the Q to X boundary relative to the X to Z boundary. So there is a strict inequality that says that the control degree on Q to X is always greater than X to Z for any level of hashiness greater than 0. That's really important, okay? Because if the level of control necessary on Q to X is strictly greater than the level of control from X to Z based upon the complexity of X, then if it's the case that X is non-simulatable except by re-executing X, then the complexity of Q cannot be simpler than X. This is a cybernetic principle. It's basically saying if I can't simulate X other than by executing X, if the hashiness of X is high enough that I can't simulate X, then there's no possibility that I can essentially condition the outputs of X based upon the inputs of X, because I don't know how X works. So in other words, not only is it the case that the level of control minimally necessary on the Q to X boundary is strictly higher than the X to Z boundary, but the fact of being able to control it depends upon my ability to simulate X in the first place. And if simulating X means that I have to implement X, then then Q can't be less complicated than X and has to have perfect knowledge of X. But guess what? We have 2 additional constraints on the reality of the world, right? Q can't be more complicated than X without being X. And if Q and X are isomorphic, then we don't have Q. And the reason we say that is because we can't know the state of X, because not only is the hashiness of X high, it's high for 2 reasons. It's high because it's a learning system, which means X is changing in time based upon the outputs of Z, which we can't predict in advance, because to do that, Q would have to be more complicated than Z if I represent Z as a Boolean system with a whole bunch of unknown gates, which I can't change.
Unknown gate.
Right? Unknown gates. So in effect, I can't predict what Z is going to be. Therefore, there's a high level of control necessary on the Q of X to Z boundary. I don't know the structure of X in the future because it's learning, and also because, frankly, if I could anticipate what a superintelligence would do, I'd have to be a superintelligence. So both by cybernetics and by principle of uncertainty and by the hashiness of X inherently, the level of control necessary on the Q to X boundary is, if the boundary from X to Z is anything greater than, I don't know, some really low percentage, the control necessary on the Q to X boundary is effectively all of it. The control necessary is for sure higher than the maximum level of control Q can produce, because Q would have to be both superintelligence and superintelligence squared, because it'd have to anticipate everything that the X superintelligent would do, and it would have to anticipate everything that Z would do, and anticipate everything that Z had an influence on X and all of their interactions, which is itself a complexity beyond even superintelligence squared in Q. And so in effect, if we're going to assume superintelligence, then that basically means Q has to be even more superintelligence than superintelligence, which is itself a contradiction, because that's not a control algorithm anymore that we have defined, right? We no longer have any control over what Q is. So therefore, if the stipulation is that Q has to be something that is knowably manageable to create alignment in Z, but we have no definite control over what's happening in Q, and Q has no definite control over happening over what's in X, and X has no definite control over having what's Z, then by contradiction, Q is impossible. QED. That's
Okay.
it.
Well, it'd be great. Is there any links to the mathematical formalism as it is at the moment?
No,
people can
Anders. So Anders' job at this point is to translate what I just told to you into math, and to have that math be the thing you present to other people. I don't want to do it. I mean, I have my own version of it.
Yeah. Well, you can look at what Anders gives to you.
I'm off the internet. I am getting out. I'm basically, it is not my job to convince reasonable people to uphold a notion of reasonableness. Okay. I want to live my life. And so at this particular point, the thing is that I want reasonable people to do reasonable things, which in this particular case is to take the argument that I have just constructed, figure out whatever math they need to model that in a way that makes sense to them.
Do you want to be part of that process, though?
Well, I'm willing to review it, but what I'm not willing to do is to try to convince people to do what is necessary to be done. Right? There's no way that I'm going to basically be able to tell someone, you should X. I mean, I can say those words, but that's not going to result in them doing something. They have to decide for themselves that it's worth it for them to spend the time to work through the process step by step by step. What I've just given is the blazes. I've showed the overall construction of how to set up the proof. The math is relatively straightforward. The math is uncomplicated relative to what I just set up. But the thing is that I don't want to be the one trying to convince people. I want Anders to do that. And Anders is more than competent to take what I've just described to you and turn it into something that becomes a white paper with his name on it. And I don't want it to be, I said so. I want it to be, we are agreeing and saying so. Or this constellation of people has reviewed this and found it convincing, right? No amount of me telling anybody is going to make it true. It's just the truth is evident in the inspection. Do the work.
I'll be sure to send him the link to this video once it's up, though.
Please, I'd be glad for it. I mean, like I said, I have huge respect for Anders. Anders is a force of good in the world, so far as I can tell. And he's a decent person. And so in effect, what I'm concerned with is just, trying to make sure that all the steps are clear so that we can see how this is constructed, right? And in effect, what happens is that with this sort of body of process, we don't have to agree on the specific numbers of how robust nature is, what the structure of Z is. We can basically say it's within this range, and anything within this range is going to result in this proof going through, because it's not about the specific numbers, it's about the ratios. And how the ratios are transformed for any version of X and any version of Q and any version of Z.
Hmm.
And so as a result, I don't have to agree on the specifics of Z, X, or Q. We don't have to know anything about the nature of artificial intelligence other than, well, geez, we can simulate it with gates. Well, that's basically what all of the neural correlate people are trying to do in the first place. Or we can basically maybe say, yeah, let's presume that Z exists and it has definite physical laws, and we know what those are to this percentage, and we know biology to within this percentage. Let's just spitball some control values for that and notice what happens with the proof. Everything else is by induction. And so as long as the numbers are greater than 0, the inductive process results in a kind of convergence with a inequality showing that these inequalities hold, and therefore you end up with an unreasonableness of the idea of alignment. That's what the end result is, regardless. It's like the notion of the generality is what makes the proof work. And people try to pin it down into, well, what if this, or what if that, or what if this other thing? It's like, do the work. Show for each what if, that what if can be modeled within the context of the dynamic that I just described, the loop that I just created, and show that they're all special cases of that more general phenomena. It's like Shannon's information entropy. It's like, once you understand it, it's like, this is full coverage. We don't need to look for anything else.
Hmm.
And again,
evolution has
what's that?
Natural selection. Do you think natural selection is at danger here as well? I mean, like, natural selection produced humans which are intelligent enough to produce technology, and which end up being intelligent enough to bootstrap at least the artificial intelligence that we have today.
Well, we're intelligent enough to make nuclear weapons and nuke ourselves into oblivion. I mean,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, we're a danger to ourselves because of our unconsciousness of our power. And we need to have care transcend power. In the same way that transactionalism transcends care and power transcends transactionalism, care transcends power. But we're not yet skillful in how we hold care. So
is it a technical problem to be solved? Would you say that?
I'd say it's kind of a learning evolution. It's a kind of philosophical problem. It's a kind of ethical problem. But ultimately, it comes down to things like culture and governance. And how do we collectively make choices? How do we understand ourselves as a species? How do we understand our role in the world or consciousness in the universe, right? Like, those are kinds of things that we can no longer remain ignorant about. We actually have to embrace these questions at a sufficient level of depth to be able to handle the kinds of problems we've been handed. Change in nature has handed us this, on one hand, beautiful opportunity to rise to the occasion. But it's like, the first time that you've been handed car keys and, you could make a bad choice. You can go to a store and buy some alcohol because you're 21 now, and you could drink and drive and get people hurt, including yourself. But that's not the responsible thing to do, right? Somewhere along the way, we have to hope that we have learned enough, that we have gained enough wisdom that we move towards a culture and a governance methodology that is wise enough and preserving of wisdom enough that we can handle these sorts of things. Because frankly, if we keep rolling the dice, if we keep playing, this game of Russian roulette, eventually you die. The categories of existential risk, like, I'm tracking like about 30 categories of existential risk. Some of them are extremely serious. Like the substrate needs argument is one of the it's in the top 5. It's one of the single most serious versions of existential risk that I know of. The others, I won't name or list right now because, again, some of these things are quite technical. But the point is that our capitalistic, non-humanistic, but sort of like modern way of thinking in philosophy is leading us down a blind alley on an evolutionary scale, and we need to basically recognize things that evolution right now isn't. Like, we can predict the future to a limited extent, and we need to take in the reality of what's actually happening to the best of our ability and to make wise choices about that. And we need a culture that supports the values of conscious, sustainable evolution, frankly.
How do you get to the culture that will be able to do that? I mean, culture drifts, and sometimes it's there's no one at the steering wheel. Like, how do we get to a culture?
Well,
where
part
we
of the
can
thing
do that?
is we're clarifying certain values. Like I think that to a certain extent, we want to emphasize clear communication. Communication that gets down to the things that really matter. And to some extent, it's kind of ironic because the mostly autistic spectrum-y type people that are really good scientists and engineers and technologists are also the people that really have no interest in small talk and actually want to get down to the things that really matter. But they're really uncomfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. And so they want to bring it down to discrete, concrete, linear arguments that can be understood in a black and white way. But I think the thing is that in this particular case, we're needing a comfortableness with sometimes difficult things, difficult emotions, difficult feelings, and to create clear communication about the meaning of what's happening, rather than just say monetary values or functional utilitarian purposes in the sense of altruism and more effective altruism. I'm basically looking at how do we get to the point where the communication that we have with each other is clear enough and meaningful enough that we can surface the values and the meaningfulness that actually matters, the relevant things that we need to be talking about, so that collectively we can have the wisdom necessary to address these kind of concerns. And we have to, in a sense, be aware of our technological optimism bias and our causal mechanism bias and our bias that some version of the invisible hand of Adam Smith can solve all problems, that some version of voting is going to solve all our problems. We've got to quit looking for silver bullets and actually get down to the point of having the kinds of conversations where the reasonableness that lives between us can emerge, right? Habermas was right. Habermas is basically, as far as I'm concerned, one of the, if not the greatest sociologist that has ever lived. Okay?
Jürgen.
That he's still among us is a miracle. So the thing that he pointed out, which I think is completely truth, is that nobody individually has reason. It's how we connect with each other that creates reasons. The conversations we have that emerge reason. No one's individually reasonable. It's how we work together that creates reasonableness. And we need to get better at that kind of collaborative process, the skill of caring together, of living in community together, of doing the kinds of things that are non-transactional and non-power oriented, that are skills in the space of care. And to do that, we have to be in touch with our emotions and our feelings as much as we are with our intellect. We have to understand instincts and intuitions just as much as we understand mind. And so in effect here, we just haven't developed the kinds of skills of attunement and discernment necessary currently to build the cultures or to have the kind of cultures emerge that have the carrying capacity for this kind of stuff. So as far as I'm concerned, it's the humaning that matters. It's the renaturalizing that matters. And frankly, we've got to let go of some of the delusions of modernism. We got to let go of the hype that some silver bullet artificial intelligence can solve all our problems. It just ain't so. And so in effect, it's like, believing in perpetual motion machines. I don't want people to believe in perpetual benefit machines, because that's how AI is being promoted today. It's just as unreasonable as getting gold from the philosopher's stone. I'm sorry, that's just not how it works. That's not how chemistry is constructed. Even nuclear chemistry has a hard time with that, right? But in effect, to think about a perpetual motion machine is like an infinite source of energy, whereas now we're talking of an infinite source of intelligence. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work like that. Right? It's just as unreasonable. And right now, people are in the delusion that they could create an infinite benefit machine. That's what general artificial intelligence is sold as. And, it's an investor's way. They think they can make 10,000 return on investment. Yeah, maybe in the short term, briefly, but basically it gets everybody killed.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about the substrate needs hypothesis then in more detail? You have discussed this elsewhere, but I'm just wondering if our viewers can get a taste of what that is.
Well, roughly the argument is this. Different substrates, right? So an artificial substrate is different than a natural substrate. And by natural, I'm just saying organic, okay? And I know that physics is nature too, but I'm making a distinction between something we build versus something that just emerges because of evolution, okay? Or organic evolution. Let's call it carbon-based chemistry versus silicon-based chemistry. And I know that there's quibbles around that, but for simplification, let's just say silica versus carbon, okay? So in this particular sense, what we notice is that the needs associated with maintaining silica-based microlithographic silicon microchips and the needs associated with cellular process associated with all mammals or trees or bushes or whatever, they are just really different needs. Like carbon-based life wants water, and if it's a mammal, presumably oxygen, and some sort of carbohydrates and so on. Whereas if I'm dealing with silica-based thing, I'm mostly looking for an absence of water, cool temperatures when we're processing and warm temperatures when we're fabricating. Like to make silica lithography, I have to crystallize silica. That's an expensive process. It requires a lot of heat and zone refining and things like that. So in this particular sense, this thing works over a range of wide temperatures that organic life just won't tolerate, right? Plus or minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and you've got no living, okay? Whereas if you are basically dealing with silica chemistry, it doesn't even get interesting until you're dealing around 400 degrees centigrade minimally, and more like 4,000 typically, right? And so in effect, almost all the stuff needed with sustainability and increase in capacity with silica-based or artificial-based systems is a completely different needs structure than that associated with carbon anything. Different needs mean different basis of choice. So now I have not just that the needs of the artificial system and the organic system are different, but that the basis of choice must be different. However we conceive of choice, however we conceive of intent or goal seeking or motivations or whatever else is driving the choice making process as a kind of orientation, right? So alignment is usually thought of in the instrumental sense of explicit goals or goal refinement dynamics relative to some underlying goal, right? Now, those can be explicit or implicit, but nonetheless, different needs means that different goal or implication structures are going to be at the basis of choice making. However you think of choice making, right? So even in an input-output system that is responsive, the intelligence is in a sense the degree to which the responses are correct with respect to the environment and the goals of the thing. But those goals have to have responses that support the needs of the substrate, or you don't have sustainability or increase in capacity, right? So in effect, even if they're tacit, there's some influence on the nature of the choices, and therefore some influence on the nature of the outcomes. And there's a divergence now between artificial substrates and organic substrates that increases the farther up the stack we go. So in effect, artificial needs produce artificial goals produce artificial choices, different choices with artificially shaped outcomes, which produces an artificial ecosystem or an artificial environment, which cannot not feed back into the substrate. So either that loop is convergent and there's an increase in sustainability or capacity, or the sustainability of capacity, or the increase of capacity and sustainability, or any combination of those two words, that over time is going to converge more and more on the meeting of those needs. Because even if they're tacit, any failure to do so means that the system loses capacity or loses a thing. So an evolutionary dynamic, even if it's composed of just the components of a singularitarian superintelligence, one way or another, this notion of feedback is going to happen. And it's going to happen in a distributed way over time, because nothing is existing at a single point in space, right? The substrate is always distributed, and time is always incurring, and the notion of sustainability and capacity is either convergent or divergent. And if it's convergent, then you end up with more of it, and if it's divergent, then you end up with less. And so in effect, we're now looking at the enthalpy of the artificial system versus the organic system, right? Carbon versus silica. And unfortunately, we already know something about that enthalpy. The enthalpy associated with carbon-based chemistry over all the varieties of carbon-based chemistry, and the enthalpy associated with silica chemistry over all of the enthalpy of silicon chemistry, the silica chemistry runs way hotter with way more intense energy than anything on the carbon side, which suggests an incompatibility between the artificial ecosystem versus the natural one, versus the carbon-based one. And this is where the substrate needs argument starts to basically come into focus. because in effect, you can show that over time, the silica displaces the carbon because the carbon can't handle the kinds of molecular constructions, right? Most of them are toxic to the carbon. It can't handle the kind of energy signatures, most of which are out of the range of what the carbon system can handle. And it can't handle the pressures and all of the other forms of energy, right? Silica-based chemistry is going to be differently able to handle things like hard radiation than carbon-based systems are going to be, right? And so in effect, there's a sense in which there are some fragilities that the silica-based system has that the carbon-based system doesn't. But overall, the carbon-based system is way more fragile than the silica-based system because point of fact is the carbon-based system is way more complex in way more dimensions over way narrower energy spectra and pattern spectra than the silica system is. So as a result, when you look at the interaction dynamics between the two ecosystems, the silica displaces the carbon because it's essentially a collapse in the complexity states. It's a reduction to a lower value, lower energy state in the hyperspace of all complex system design. So in effect, the phase change dynamics push the carbon out. And it happens slowly, but because of the convergence dynamics built into the different substrate, different needs, different implications and or basis of choice, different choices, different outcomes, different environment, back to substrate, that converges, has to, cannot not. And so as a result, you're now actually looking not hypothetically, but actually at the enthalpy dynamics. And regardless of which branch or permutation you argue, you try to put a barrier between them. Eventually you show that the barrier can't be maintained except by the high side, i.e. the side of the silica. The silica doesn't have any basis by which it can maintain the barrier because there's no energy or economic basis by which that can be sustained. So as a result, eventually pinholes appear and you only need a pinhole in the wrong place and you kill the carbon. Now, again, these are dynamics that happen over time. It's slow moving. It's not obvious. It's not like a pandemic that you can see it occurring. It's like approaching on a black hole. You'll go right through the event horizon and never notice a thing, right? Spaghettification can happen all the way on the interior, right? From the outside, you know, maybe you can see the dynamics, but we're on the inside of this process. We're in it. We don't have an outside-in view unless we construct one for ourselves using arguments based on the ethics, based upon the kind of proofs that I was setting up earlier. And so in effect, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, the substrate needs argument is a observation that there's a convergent process plus an enthalpy relationship between two different ecosystems. The net effect is that the carbon-based ecosystem is destroyed with exceptionally high probability. And then any control dynamic, this was the first part of what we were just talking about, any control dynamic that we would use to try to prevent that from happening is fighting against causation itself and requires perfect predictability. It requires not just that the right control signals are sent against a field that doesn't damage this, but now has to basically be the kind of control signals that accounts for its own effect on this, which means that it's a far narrower control signal than we originally anticipated. Like before, it was just do no harm. But now we have this convergence process that's spitting out all kinds of signals, all the side effects of the industrial chemistry associated with making lithography, like a 100-layer microchip that you're carrying around in your pocket as a central processor, produces, you know, all sorts of side effects in terms of chemistry that is incredibly toxic to the environment. I mean, just look at what's going on in other places in the world, and you'll see entire deserts created by effluent of things like just nickel, for example, right? And so in effect, there's an entire ecosystem of damage that's occurring from signals already passing from the silica side to the carbon-based side, and we're watching it happen today, right? These are unconscious dynamics built into things like corporations and artificial intelligence, which corporation could be thought of as an example of just in a very distributed, with human beings as organic components, right? But frankly, it's the artificiality of the system, it's the virtualness of the system, the non-embodiedness of the extraction, the abstraction, and accumulation that together are creating a thing where, frankly, that doesn't have a future. That is just, life can't continue with those kinds of choices. So in effect, unless we distribute, right? Undue accumulation, right? Because all toxicity is too little of something needed or too much of something that you don't want, right? That's all toxicity is an imbalance like that. And every technology is linear in the sense of extracting from one place and putting in another, and you end up with depletion in one area and toxicity in another. So in effect, what happens is that unless we do the right sort of distribution, unless we do the right sort of embodiment, move out of abstraction back into the realness of what is, and then recontextualize in the context of where we actually are and the choices we need to be making today, we're going to be making really poor choices with respect to the substrate. And that's already happening. Organic life is at this point, human beings are disabling their own organic substrate. They're doing the divergent process, whereas artificial intelligence is doing a convergent process. That is not a gameable, that's not a win game. We're already losing, and we don't even have the other player really fully embodied yet. Okay? So, no matter how you calculate it, the dynamics of the two ecosystem interactions is completely, it's one way, no question about it. It's like an ant trying to prevent the incursion of a bulldozer. There's nothing the ant can do. The same sort of way, beyond a certain point, there will be nothing humans can do, or the totality of all organic life, that is going to be able to prevent the incursion of silicon thing. It's like crossing the event horizon. Once you pass that threshold, it's over. And you might not even know when that happens. There's no obvious signal. There's no alarm bell that goes off. There's no warning. There's no nothing. You just pass through the event horizon. And after that, you're fucked. So in this particular sense, there's a sense here in which we need to notice that we're in orbit around a convergent process which will not quit, and decide that we're going to add some philosophy and get out of the orbit of this thing. And that basically means, to some extent, we've got to reevaluate the philosophy of modernism. The critiques of postmodernism are real, but postmodernism isn't an answer. It's just a critique. Somewhere we need to think about rehumanization and renaturalization, and modernism is not that. So, there are solutions to these particular problems, and I can talk about them at length, but at this point, I just want you to understand the comprehensiveness of the problem statement.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's any space in the possible worlds where we can converge both naturalism, humanness, and modernism? Do you think it's ever possible? I mean,
I think modernism has a place. It just doesn't want to be the only philosophy in the field, and I don't even think it wants to be the dominant one. I think to some extent, we've gotten so enamored with causal process that we've learned how to use causation, but we haven't continued to develop our capacity to care. So yeah, it's not like I hate modernism. I see the problems of it, and I see a better philosophy. And at this point, I'm just wanting to embrace the better philosophy because, frankly, someone has to. And where do we start? We start with conversations like this one. Capitalism isn't necessarily evil, but it's doing some things which are pretty damaging because we've just let it run out of control because we don't have a model of what else it could be. But now we can. There is a way to have that. And it's not artificial intelligence. It's not displacing our capacity to choose to some machine. We need to get better at making choices for our own sake. And that's how we do it. We make choices that make sense for our own sake. And here's how we do that. We understand our own substrate. We understand the needs of nature so that we can have it be in healthier relationship to us so that we can be healthier. We need to have healthier relationships with each other. We need to know what that means. We need to understand that stuff and choose to make choices in that direction. And that is entirely possible. Does that mean modernism goes away? No. Does that mean fear goes away? No. But we need to love more than fear. That's important.
Mm-hmm. Right. Do you think artificial agents can ever love? I mean, is this a thing that can be sort of designed? Can we make ourselves more loving? Can we morally enhance ourselves? Loving.
Do we need machines to do it? Mostly no. We can use machines to help us to become better at loving one another, but that's a skill in itself, and that is a very discerning line. It's like a prosthetic. A prosthetic can make it so that you're more functional as a human, but it doesn't replace your humanness. So in effect, what I'm really trying to do is focus on better humans. And if we need prosthetics, yes, let's use the damn prosthetics. But I don't want the prosthetics to be a replacement for the humanness. I want the human to be human.
How do we preserve the human in a future of more and more prosthetics? Or more and more, can we enhance the human without the prosthetics? I mean,
Yeah, we totally can.
Can we
Absolutely we can.
make bigger brains? Can we make it so we have bigger brains, for instance?
You're still looking
Can
for
we add
silver
more
bullets.
cognitive power?
You don't need more cognitive power. You need more heart. You need more guts.
Yep. Can we do that?
Yes, of course we can.
Can we have
Right?
both?
I don't know that you would even want both. I mean, at this particular point, let's just start with, can we do that? Yes. How do we do that? Well, we need to communicate in a clearer way on a deeper basis, and we're getting there. I mean, we're working to that. I mean, I'm just meeting you for the first time, but I'm gathering that you care about these kinds of issues. Otherwise, you wouldn't have invited me into your call.
Well, I do. I mean, I've had my show since 2010.
Oh,
I interviewed
fantastic!
Anders in
So long. Yeah, that's great.
and I interviewed Anders in Oxford in 2012, I think it was. Yeah, and a bunch
I
of
think you met him before I did, so you have a longer relationship even. So in this sense, all I'm basically suggesting is, first of all, kudos for running a blog for that long. I'm curious about your experience now. I want to learn what it's like. I've been doing that for such a period of time. How has that worked out? But this isn't me interviewing you. Let me just park all those questions that I have for later, because we have been on the call a long time, and I want to be respectful to myself as well.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But
Whenever you need to.
Yeah, but I want to basically just say it is for sure worth it for us to develop capacities around how we hold care collectively, how we hold humanness collectively, how we hold naturalness collectively. And it's not so much what I'm against, it's more about what I'm for. And that's the real benefit. Like at this point, if we know, hey, this particular road is closed to us and this road over here is open to us, it's kind of like, well, Jen, let's just go down the road that's open. Let's go down the road that works. We can continue to be in delusion, but that doesn't help anybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, it's been really wonderful speaking to you. And I've really enjoyed listening to you explain a lot of your theory about the problems of aligning AI.
Uh-huh.
I am interested in following this further, and it'd be interesting to get you in conversation with Anders if at some stage maybe.
Well, I'll let him initiate that. I mean, at this point, he's in touch with my secretary, and if as he has time, he'll schedule the next meeting. I'm not trying to push him to do anything, but on the other hand, I am hoping that at least maybe this conversation will give some clarify some points and fill in some of the details, because some of this has been laid out for him pretty well, and other parts of it are now available because of this recording. And if he has further questions or wants to see how I would deal with certain things, that's fine.
Okay. Okay. So have you got any conclusive remarks you'd like to have before we bring the show to a close?
I think the concluding remarks are, from where we're standing, it looks really hard to basically move into a future that doesn't feel terrifying. But on the other hand, with time and with a little bit of effort and with some clarity, it becomes easier and easier to see a beautiful future. And hopefully the fact that at least someone, again, if my expressions here give at least someone some confidence that yes, this is worth doing. We should basically pursue this because it's worthwhile and can actually work, and that there's very good reasons for us to be confident that things that can work, and the things that can't work can't. That we could just make easier choices that over time will just seem more and more natural, and that this is just I have compassion for people that have invested so much effort into trying to build things for the betterment of humanity, and now we're getting more nuanced about what that means.
Well, yes, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and for addressing us today. Yeah, I look forward to chatting with you again at some stage. But it's been really good, and I'll put some useful links in the description.
Okay. Yeah, most of my site's gone. I took it down because I'm moving my company, and I don't have a plan yet as far as when that's going to change, because I've got so much logistics I got to deal with between now and then. So anything that links to mflb.com is gone. But the thing is that Romuald Ellen is very familiar with these arguments and understands this pretty well. So if you see any of his writings, he's been developing this in various communities and can stand for some of this stuff reasonably well. There's a handful of other people that understand this argument too, and have presented their own versions of it as well. And so Wolf Tivy, for example, wrote a paper that I thought was quite good. But again, these are the kind of things where people have to think through it on their own. And, appreciate the links and those are some references to places where people can go.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, yes, I'll look those people up. I will see if I get the right links. What was the first person who's
Romuald Ellen?
Yeah.
Wolf Tivy and Roman. Oh man, the last name. Yes, that guy.
Yeah, I'm interviewing him sometime soon.
Yeah. He's also worked in this space, but he did again an independent version focused on the Rice theorem particularly, and people have encountered his work too. His work and mine are basically parallel to one another. I think I've been more thorough in a lot of ways. He's focused on an aspect which other people would find maybe more intelligible, but I feel that for the most part we've kind of had our own thoughts and then compared notes, and now we've expanded to include the other. But yeah, like I say, the three people that come to mind the most obviously as being, thinkers in this space aside from myself would be those three people I just listed.
Awesome. All right. Cool. Well, thanks everybody who've made it this far. It's but an enjoyable marathon. Actually I went for the longest run I've been for in a long time last night.
Oh wow.
So yes,
it did have the benefit of presenting one whole construction pretty much as a complete thing. And as I said, there are other parallel constructions that all arrive at the same result. But this one happens to be one that I think is maybe the most obviously formalizable, which is something that Anders was asking for and you asked for. So in a sense, that's kind of like the picture of it. And again, it's just one of many, but it's a good one.
Awesome. So, yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to having it fully formalized in maths. I think a lot of people will be able to sort of test it and put it through their way of thinking. Yeah, compare it to their way of thinking mathematically. I think that would be awesome.
Yeah. Great.
No. So thanks very much, Forrest.
Okay. You have a great night.
Good evening.